I stood in the darkness, my hand trembling slightly around my phone, watching more than 60 people dancing, drinking, and laughing on the land I had poured 32 years of sweat into keeping. They raised their glasses to celebrate my son's birthday, while I, his own mother, wasn't even invited. At exactly 11 p.m., I touched the screen. The entire farm plunged into darkness. The laughter stopped cold. Screams rang out. And then, through a speaker system they didn't even know existed, my voice echoed, distorted, icy. The owner is watching every single one of you. From that moment on, I knew they would never underestimate me again. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like, so it can reach even further. Just seconds earlier, music had been blasting across the Oregon Valley. Loud pop songs I had never understood, now swallowed whole, as if someone had yanked the plug on the entire world. The string lights hanging between the old oak trees snapped off. The pool behind the house became a bottomless black void. I heard the crash of shattered glass, a woman screaming in shock, a man swearing as he tripped over folding chairs scattered across the lawn. I stood behind the old wooden door of the barn, where Richard, my husband, used to keep the tractor and tools. The smell of damp wood, old engine oil, and nighttime earth blended together, so familiar that if I closed my eyes, I could almost believe I was 30 years younger again, back when we were both young, our hands caked with mud, but our hearts full of hope. Only one thing was different. Tonight, I was no longer the woman standing beside her husband. I was someone treated as if she didn't exist. I didn't step out. I didn't say another word. I just stood there, silently watching through the narrow crack in the door, where the glow of my phone screen reflected on my face. On the screen was the live feed from the security cameras they had no idea I'd installed months earlier. More than 60 people, my daughter-in-law's friends, my son's colleagues, strangers who had never greeted me once, were scrambling in panic like a flock of birds startled in the night. Someone slipped and fell into the pool, water splashing as screams erupted. Someone else stepped on an extension cord and yanked down an entire row of banquet tables. A 3-tier birthday cake collapsed, white frosting smeared across the tiles. I saw Samantha, my daughter-in-law, in her tight white dress, her hair carefully curled, her face panicked but still trying to shout, "Calm down, it's just a power outage." Her voice pierced the chaos, high and strained. Daniel, my son, stood in the middle of the crowd. I recognized his shape even in the dark. He was tall like his father, broad-shouldered, but now he stood frozen, both hands raised as if trying to calm everyone. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I saw his lips moving, saw the glow from someone's phone lighting up his face, the face of the child I once rocked to sleep, held tight through stormy nights, and swore I would protect from every hurt in the world. I wondered in that moment whether he thought of me, whether it occurred to him that the woman who gave birth to him, paid every dollar of his college tuition, and stood behind every one of his successes, was standing somewhere very close, yet impossibly far away. I heard a man shout, "What the hell is going on?" Another woman whimpered, "I'm scared. Is this some kind of joke?" No one was laughing anymore. No music, no clinking glasses, just the raw, chaotic sound of fear and lost control. And in that moment, I realized a cold truth. How quickly all the polished appearances, the Instagram photos, the boasts about a perfect family, collapse the second the lights go out. I took a deep breath. My chest ached, not from fear, but from something far more bitter. I hadn't been invited. Not a single text, not one call, not one, "Mom, we're having a small party tonight. Would you like to come?" Instead, I found out about my son's birthday through a photo Samantha posted on social media. Birthday night at our place. Family and friends only. Family and friends. I didn't belong to either of those words. This was my farm, the land Richard and I bought when we were choking on bank debt, when every weekend meant driving nearly 2 hours from Portland, eating cold sandwiches, and sleeping in a beat-up trailer. I planted every tree, fixed every stretch of fence, cleaned every window pane, and yet tonight I stood like an intruder, hiding in the dark, watching others celebrate on my life. I felt no joy watching them panic, none at all. My heart didn't dance with revenge. What I felt was a strange stillness, as if some part of me had just died, and the rest of me had finally woken up. I knew that if I stepped out now, if I shouted that this was my home, that they had no right. They would only look at me with pity, or worse, see me as a difficult old woman ruining their fun. I had been seen that way before, too many times. So I chose the darkness. I chose silence. I chose to observe. As the noise slowly died down, I watched small groups begin to leave. They were rushed, awkward, no one thinking about goodbyes or cleaning up. Cars pulled out of the lot, headlights sweeping across the grass, leaving brief streaks of light before disappearing. Only about 20 people remained, huddled together, whispering, eyes darting around as if something were watching them from the dark. And something was. I didn't turn the power back on. Not yet. I wanted them to feel, long enough, what it was like not to belong, what it felt like to be pushed aside, the same unease I had carried for months. I wanted to remember this moment myself, so that later, if I softened, if I wondered whether I'd gone too far, I would remember this night, the night I stood in the dark on my own land. Finally, when the clock on my phone ticked over to 11:17 p.m., I closed the app. No further. Warnings. No final message. I let the darkness finish speaking for me. I turned my back and leaned against the cold wooden wall. My knees trembled, not from fear, but from a heavy question that rose in my mind and refused to leave. How does a mother get pushed this far? When did I become expendable in my own family? When did a lifetime of sacrifice turn into a burden, something that could be brushed aside for someone else's convenience? I knew that if I didn't stop here, if I didn't turn back and face everything that led up to this moment, tonight would be nothing more than a meaningless scare. What I had done wasn't the end. It was only the end of my silence. And to understand why I had to stand in the dark, why I had to shut off the power to my own farm, I needed to go back much further, to the days when I still believed that loving hard enough meant your family would never turn their back on you. My farm sits at the edge of a small valley in southern Oregon, where mornings are often wrapped in a thin layer of fog over the grass, and afternoons carry the scent of old pine from the distant forest. From above, it isn't the neat, perfectly squared kind of land you see in real estate ads. It stretches unevenly, hugging a gentle slope, winding around a small creek that runs year-round. To outsiders, it's just a large, quiet farm with income potential. To me, it is an entire lifetime. 32 years ago, this place was nothing but raw land. No fences, no clear roads, just weeds up to my knees, rocks packed into hard soil, and dead tree stumps left behind from an abandoned logging attempt. I remember clearly the first day Richard and I stood in the middle of it. It was cold in March, the wind cutting through us. I pulled my old jacket tight, and Richard smiled, a smile so optimistic it made me both love him and fear for him. He turned to me and said, "Maggie, can you imagine it? Right here, we'll build a house. Not big, but ours." We were so poor back then that if anyone had asked what our biggest asset was, I would have said Richard's old pickup truck and his set of tools. I was a nurse, working night shifts at the local hospital. Richard did whatever manual labor he could find: roof repairs, wall framing, plumbing, anything people would hire him for. We bought this land with a loan that left our wallets nearly empty every month. No one around us believed we could turn that wild land into a real home. But Richard believed. And when Richard believed, he worked. In those early years, we lived in an old trailer parked at the edge of the property. Summers were suffocating, winters drafty through every crack. I worked days, then came home at night to help him measure, clear rocks, burn dry weeds. Some nights we were so exhausted we ate canned soup straight from the pot, sitting on the ground staring at a sky full of stars without saying a word. And yet, in that silence, I never once felt alone. Richard built the frame of our first house with his own hands. It wasn't a dream home, just a simple wooden house, enough to keep out the rain and cold. I helped by holding ladders, handing him nails, sweeping up, cooking for us both. I still remember the smell of fresh lumber mixed with paint and sweat. Remember the blisters on my hands from gripping a hammer too long. Every wall that went up was progress, not just for the house, but for the life we were fighting for. When Daniel was born, the farm was still a mess. I held him in my arms, watching Richard dig drainage trenches in the rain, my heart torn between worry and pride. By the time Rachel arrived, the house was sturdier, with an extra small room and a front porch where we could watch the sunset. The farm grew alongside our children, and our children grew alongside the farm. Daniel learned to walk on uneven ground, falling and standing back up, scraped knees but shining eyes. Rachel loved chasing the chickens I kept, laughing every time they scattered. On weekends, Richard took Daniel to the open field behind the house to teach him how to throw a baseball, while I sat on the steps, sewing and watching them in the afternoon light. Those memories don't need photos. They're etched into me more clearly than any picture. The farm wasn't just a place to live. It was our children's first classroom, where they learned hard work, patience, and respect for things that aren't easily earned. Daniel helped his father build fences. Rachel helped me pick vegetables from the garden. Every family meal carried the smell of earth, grass, and real labor. We weren't wealthy, but we never felt poor. Then, one autumn afternoon, everything stopped. Richard died suddenly, a heart attack, so fast there was no time to prepare, no time to say goodbye. He collapsed right on the front porch, where we had sat together drinking morning coffee so many times. When I ran out, he was already there, eyes closed, his face cruelly peaceful. I remember screaming, but the sound felt swallowed by the vast space of the farm, as if no one could hear it. I became a widow at an age when I still believed there were many we moments ahead of us. The house felt too big, too quiet. At night, I heard the wind move through the trees and instinctively turned toward the right side of the bed where Richard used to sleep. Some mornings I made 2 cups of coffee before realizing I only needed 1. Every corner of the farm carried his imprint: the unfinished wooden chair he was building, the coat hook he mounted behind the door, the gravel path he laid by hand. Daniel and Rachel were grown, living their own lives. I didn't blame them for not being with me every day, but alone on this vast land, I finally understood what it meant to carry responsibility tied to memory. Selling the farm would have been easy, very easy. Less than a year after Richard's funeral, people knocked on my door offering to buy it. The prices they quoted would have let me live comfortably for the rest of my life in a small city apartment. I thought about it, I truly did. But every time I imagined signing those papers, I felt like I was erasing pieces of Richard, of our life together. This farm wasn't something I inherited. It was something we paid for with our youth, our strength, our sleepless nights. Selling it wouldn't have been a financial transaction. To me, it would have been a betrayal. So I refused, again and again. The farm became the place where I kept Richard with me. I cared for every tree the way he once did. I fixed broken things not because I couldn't hire help, but because I wanted to continue our habits. Some nights I sat on the porch and talked to myself, as if he were still listening. Others might call that weakness. To me, it was survival without losing myself. I didn't realize that my determination to keep this farm, my refusal to see it as just property, would make it something others wanted to take. Back then, I thought simply, as long as I'm alive, clear-headed, and standing on this land, no one gets to decide for me. I never imagined my greatest challenge wouldn't come from outsiders. It would come from my own family. Daniel is my eldest son. Even as a child, he was the one adults trusted. Not reckless, not overly mischievous, always thoughtful, always trying. When Richard was alive, he used to say, "Daniel's like me when I was young. He knows how to look ahead. He knows when to hold back." I believed that for years, and maybe that belief is what kept me from seeing his change sooner. Daniel was a good student. Richard and I poured nearly all our savings into sending him to law school. Those years weren't easy. I worked more night shifts. Richard took heavier jobs he used to avoid. But every time Daniel called, excited about an internship or a difficult case, I felt every sacrifice was worth it. When he graduated and became a lawyer, I cried. Not just from pride, but because I knew my son could now stand on his own. After Richard died, Daniel called me more than anyone else, at least for a while. He asked how I was doing, whether I needed anything, whether I wanted to come live with him in the city for a bit. I refused, as I refused every suggestion to leave the farm. Back then, Daniel understood. He said, "I know you love that place." I thought that was enough. Then Samantha appeared. Daniel introduced her one late spring afternoon. They drove down from Portland, their new car gleaming as it pulled up to the porch. I stepped outside, wiping my hands on my apron, forcing a smile. Samantha got out first. She was tall, slim, her blonde hair carefully styled, her high heels completely wrong for the gravel ground of the farm. She smiled beautifully, so perfectly I didn't quite know how to respond. "Hello, Maggie," she said, her voice sweet and clear. "I've finally met you." I nodded and shook her hand. Her hand was cold and soft, nothing like the hands of people used to labor. I didn't think badly of her then. I simply noticed the way someone who's lived long enough learns to observe before judging. The first time Samantha came to the farm, she walked around very slowly, not the curious stroll of someone visiting the countryside for the first time, but the deliberate survey of someone taking mental notes. Her eyes moved over the fence, lingered on the barn, paused at the wide field behind the house, before she leaned toward Daniel and asked him something quietly. I didn't hear the words, but I saw Daniel nod. "There's so much space here," Samantha said, sounding impressed. "It's rare to find a place this quiet and, with this kind of potential." I just smiled. To me, the place didn't need potential. It only needed peace. At dinner that night, Samantha talked a lot. She spoke about her work in marketing, about branding campaigns, about building personal images on social media. I listened but didn't fully understand. I was used to conversations about patients, night shifts, gardens, and weather. Samantha's world was far from mine. Some of her comments sounded harmless at first. This farm would get so much attention online. People in the city pay a fortune just to spend a weekend like this. I nodded and let it pass. I thought it was just enthusiasm from someone used to crowded places. But Samantha didn't stop there. Every visit after that, she mentioned potential again. Not potential for living, but for exploiting. Potential for events. Potential for vacation rentals. Potential for branding. The words repeated, often enough that they began to weigh on me. "I'm just saying," she laughed when she noticed my silence, "don't think too much about it." I told myself the same thing. Don't overthink. Don't be suspicious. Your son wouldn't mean harm. Your future daughter-in-law is just speaking from professional habit. I comforted myself with the very maternal trust I believed could never be wrong. But Daniel changed. At first it was subtle. So subtle you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. He asked me fewer questions. Our conversations drifted toward work, plans, the future. He talked about optimization, about long-term investments. When I told him about repairing the chicken coop roof or replacing old water pipes, he just hummed, as if those things no longer mattered. Once I joked, "This farm is getting old, just like me." Daniel laughed, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He replied, "Old things need to change, Mom." That sentence stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. Samantha began posting photos every time they visited the farm. Sunsets, outdoor meals, Daniel standing in the middle of the wide field. The captions were always polished, carefully worded, "Peaceful weekends." An escape from the city. I wasn't in those photos. At first I thought she'd just forgotten. Then I realized my absence was intentional. Once, when I accidentally stepped into the frame, Samantha said, "Maggie, could you stand over there a bit? The light's better here." Her tone was polite, gentle. I stepped out of the frame without a word, but that was when the feeling of being pushed out of my own story truly began. Daniel didn't object. He stood there in silence, as if my being pushed out of the photo was something too trivial to care about. And that silence, more than any words, made me feel cold. I still tried to keep everything normal. I cooked, made coffee, asked about their work. I didn't want to become a difficult mother-in-law. I didn't want to plant the seeds of conflict. I had seen too many families fall apart because of misunderstandings left unspoken. I didn't want to be the one who caused that, but deep inside, a quiet unease began to grow. It wasn't the fear of losing the land. It was the fear of losing my place. The fear that, in my son's eyes, I was no longer the mother who had built this life alongside his father, but just an old woman living on a piece of land that was not being used properly. The first signs of takeover didn't come as grand actions. They came as questions that sounded caring. Do you ever feel tired managing such a big farm by yourself? Have you thought about the future? What if you get sick? Those questions were repeated often enough, gently enough, that if I reacted strongly, I would look overly sensitive. I didn't react. I just listened. And I began to understand that Samantha didn't see memories in this place. She saw numbers. She saw opportunities. And Daniel, my son, was standing between those two ways of seeing. And little by little, I realized he was turning his back on memory. I didn't yet know that this was only the beginning. But in my heart, one thing became clear. If I wasn't careful, if I kept comforting myself with maternal love, one day I would wake up and realize that everything I had built no longer belonged to me. Nothing happened suddenly. There was no explosive moment I could point to and say, that's when it all went wrong. The boundary was erased in a far quieter way, like water seeping into the ground, slow, persistent, and by the time you notice, the foundation has long been cold and wet. At first, it was just suggestions. Samantha stood in the kitchen, holding the cup of coffee I had just made, her eyes moving around the room that Richard and I had spent nearly 10 years finishing piece by piece. "Maggie," she said lightly, like a breeze passing through, "have you ever thought about changing the kitchen cabinets? This style is a bit old-fashioned. If you painted them white and changed the handles, it would look so much brighter." I smiled politely. "I'm used to it. It's still fine for me." Samantha shrugged, as if I had just missed a rare opportunity. "Of course, I'm just suggesting. Sometimes a small change really lifts the spirit." At the time, I didn't respond. I thought maybe she was just speaking out of professional habit, seeing everything as something that needed upgrading or refreshing. I had lived long enough to know that not every suggestion is an intrusion, but those suggestions didn't stop. Next, Samantha talked about the living room. "If you knocked down this wall and opened it up to the porch, it would be amazing. Open concept spaces are really popular." Then she moved on to Richard's old bedroom. "It would make more sense as a home office. Leaving it empty like that is kind of a waste." I listened, and each time I did, it felt like someone was placing their hands on my memories and twisting them in a different direction. I started answering less. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to argue. I thought that as long as I didn't say yes, everything would stay at the level of words. I was wrong. One Saturday morning, while I was watering the garden behind the house, I heard an unfamiliar car stop at the gate. It wasn't Daniel's car. It wasn't a delivery truck. I turned off the hose, wiped my hands on my pants, and walked out. Standing on my porch were two men I had never seen before, holding tape measures and notebooks. Samantha stood beside them, hands on her hips, chatting animatedly. "Hi, Maggie." She turned to me when she saw me. "I brought these guys by to take a quick look. They're designers. Really good ones." I froze. "Take a look at what?" "Oh," Samantha said quickly, as if this had already been agreed upon, "just some basic measurements, so I can get an idea of what a renovation might look like. We're not doing anything right away." I looked at the men. They had already started pulling out their tape, measuring the length of the living room wall. One crouched to inspect the wooden floor. Another was writing things down. They walked into my house as if they had permission. My heart started pounding, not from anger, but from a very clear sense of violation. "Samantha," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me, "you didn't ask me." She hesitated for a split second, then smiled. "Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. I thought—" "Daniel mentioned that you were considering some of these things too." I turned to look at Daniel, who had just stepped out of the car. He avoided my eyes for a brief moment, then said, "I just said we could think about it in the future, Mom." The future. Such a convenient word. I took a deep breath. "I don't need any measurements. Thank you, gentlemen, but today isn't appropriate." The two men looked at each other, then at Samantha, as if waiting for instructions. Her face flushed slightly, but she kept her smile. "Of course. No problem. I didn't mean anything by it. I just wanted to help you see more options." After they left, the air in the house grew heavy. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my hands trembling slightly. Daniel came closer. "You overreacted," he said quietly. Samantha just wants what's best for you." I looked at my son, searching for the eyes I remembered, the eyes of the child who used to ask my permission before climbing a tree. "Do you see," I said, "that she brought strangers into my house without asking?" Daniel sighed. "You always see everything as an invasion. You should be a little more open-minded." Open-minded? Another word that sounded so good. From then on, the small conversations grew more tense. Samantha no longer just suggested. She started talking as if changes were inevitable. When we finished fixing this part, "If we rearrange that area," I noticed how naturally she used the word "we," as if she were already a co-owner here. I objected, not loudly, not angrily, just saying no. And every time I said no, I was given a new label. "You're too attached to the past. You refuse to change. You're always so rigid." Daniel didn't say those things himself, but he didn't stop Samantha when she did. His silence felt like agreement. I found myself having to explain everything, even things that never should have needed explanation. Why I didn't want to knock down walls, why I didn't want to replace the windows, why I didn't want to turn Richard's room into a multi-purpose space. The small arguments became more frequent. Not big fights, but fragments of dialogue, enough to wear away intimacy. I said one thing. Samantha responded with a patient smile tinged with pity. Daniel stood between us, but little by little, I saw him standing closer to Samantha. Once I heard my own son say, "Mom always makes everything more complicated." That hurt more than I expected. I began to feel out of place in my own home. When they visited, I felt unnecessary. Samantha moved things around for convenience and forgot to put them back. She talked to Daniel about plans and ideas while I sat there like an audience member. Shared meals became shorter, more awkward. I ate more slowly, not because I was tired, but because I didn't want to speak. One evening, while Samantha and Daniel were animatedly discussing upgrading the farm, I stood up to clear the dishes. Samantha watched me and said, "Don't worry, Maggie, we can handle these things. You just need to rest." Rest. As if I were already frail, as if I were no longer the person who built all of this. I went to bed early that night. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I looked around the familiar room and suddenly felt it was foreign. Not because the furniture had changed, but because my place in this house had changed. I was no longer the center, no longer the decision maker. I was being pushed to the margins, little by little, through gentle words and polite smiles. My relationship with Daniel fractured quietly. There was no big fight followed by forgiveness, just a growing distance. He called less, asked my opinion less. When I disagreed with Samantha, he looked at me with weariness, as if I were a problem to be solved. I began to understand something frightening. I was no longer seen as a mother, but as an obstacle, something that needed to be handled carefully so plans could move forward smoothly. And in that prolonged silence, I realized the boundary had already been erased, not by documents or signatures, but by attitude, by the way they spoke about this farm as if it no longer fully belonged to me. I still lived here. I still cared for every tree and every patch of land. But in the eyes of my son and the woman beside him, I had gradually become an outsider. That was when I understood. If I didn't stand firm, if I kept giving in out of fear of losing my child, what I would lose wouldn't just be the farm. I would lose myself. That conversation didn't happen in a closed room, nor did it begin with dramatic tension. It took place on a quiet afternoon on the wooden porch where Richard and I had sat hundreds of times watching the sun set behind the trees. That familiarity made every word spoken that day feel even heavier. Daniel arrived earlier than usual. He parked neatly, walked up onto the porch with a hesitant posture, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Samantha followed, her heels tapping sharply against the steps. I noticed the difference immediately. They didn't bring food, didn't ask how I was, didn't make small talk like before. The atmosphere felt exactly like meetings I'd seen at the hospital, when people came not to ask, but to announce. Daniel spoke first. "Mom, we want to talk seriously with you for a bit." I nodded, poured tea, and placed 3 cups on the small table. My hands were steady, but something inside me tightened, like a string pulled taut. "Go ahead." Daniel cleared his throat. "You know the farm is big. There's a lot of work, and you—" He hesitated, searching for words. "You're not young anymore." The sentence wasn't loud or harsh, but it landed on the porch like a stone. I looked at my son, the child I once carried across this land, and for the first time I saw the distance between us clearly. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice even. Samantha jumped in quickly as if she'd been waiting. "Maggie, don't misunderstand. We're just worried about you. Such a big farm, handling everything alone. It must be exhausting. What if something happens?" Worried about me. I had heard that phrase many times lately, but today it carried a different tone. It was no longer concern. It sounded like a conclusion already reached. Daniel looked at me, his eyes tinged with pity. "We think maybe it's time to share the right to use the farm. You'd still be the owner, of course, but we'd handle the main management. That way you wouldn't have to work so hard." Share the right to use. I repeated the phrase silently. It sounded harmless, even reasonable, if framed as children helping an aging mother. But I wasn't helpless. I still drove myself, fixed fences, managed every bill, and more importantly, I had never said I wanted to hand anything over. "So, you want me to give you the farm?" I asked bluntly. Daniel shook his head. "Not give, share, together. You'd still live here just like before. We just make the big decisions." The big decisions. I didn't ask more. Samantha had already launched into her pitch, her voice bright like she was presenting a business plan. "Just imagine, this place is so beautiful. If we rent it out for events, it would be amazing. Weddings, birthdays, weekend retreats. If done right, it could bring in a decent amount every month." I looked straight at her. "Who is we?" She hesitated briefly, then smiled again. "Our family, of course." Family. Coming from her, the word felt strangely hollow. I set my teacup down. "This farm is not a place for parties." Samantha tilted her head, her tone gentle. "But you're not using all of it. Leaving it like this is such a waste." A waste. A word I had never used to describe my life. Daniel continued, no longer circling the point. "Mom, honestly, keeping the farm like this isn't efficient. It's like a dead asset." A dead asset. I heard every word clearly, and in that moment I knew something had broken. Not on the farm, but inside me. 32 years of sweat, blood, and memories, mine, Richard's, our children's childhood, in my son's eyes, reduced to something unproductive. A dead asset? I repeated quietly. "You're calling the place you grew up, the place your father collapsed, a dead asset?" Daniel frowned. "Don't be so sensitive. I'm talking about economics." Economics? I laughed, but the sound was dry. "So you studied law just to talk to your mother like an investor?" Samantha cut in, her voice edged with impatience. "Maggie, I think you're being too emotional. These days, everyone has to be practical." Practical. I knew that word well. It was often used to cover things people didn't want to name honestly. "I don't need your kind of practicality," I said, dropping the polite address for the first time. "And I don't need anyone managing my life." The air thickened. Daniel stood up, pacing the porch as if trying to calm himself. "You're overreacting. We don't mean any harm." "Then what do you mean?" I asked. "Bringing strangers to measure my house? Talking about renting it out without asking me? Calling my life's work a dead asset?" Daniel turned back to me, irritation flashing in his eyes, an expression I had never seen before. "You always turn everything into a personal attack." I stood up too, facing my son. The evening wind swept across the porch, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass. Peaceful surroundings, but my heart wasn't. "You know," I said slowly, "I'm not afraid of change. I'm afraid of losing my right to decide." Samantha crossed her arms. "That's not fair. We're just trying to help." "Helping without asking," I replied. "Helping by imposing." Daniel exhaled sharply. "You can't just stubbornly hold on to everything forever. One day you won't be able to handle it." That sentence sent a chill through me. Not because it was wrong, but because it showed me he had been imagining my helplessness for a long time. "Are you waiting for that day?" I asked. Daniel fell silent. Samantha looked away, avoiding my gaze. I looked at both of them, and in that moment I understood clearly. This was no longer a discussion. It was a dangerous proposal, wrapped in the paper of concern. If I agreed today, tomorrow I would be expected to agree again, until I no longer had the right to say no. "You should leave," I said. Daniel froze. "What did you say?" "I said you should leave. Now." Samantha opened her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand. "There's nothing more to say. This farm is mine. Until I invite you, you have no right to be here." Daniel stared at me, his expression shifting from shock to anger. "You're kicking me out of my own home?" "I'm asking you to leave the farm," I corrected him. "Those are two different things." In that moment, my son looked at me like I was a stranger, and the most frightening part wasn't that look. It was the realization that I no longer recognized him either. The man standing in front of me wasn't the boy who used to run after me in the garden, but someone weighing interests and control. They left in silence. No goodbye, no promise to talk again. I stood alone on the porch, listening to the engine start, the tires crunch against gravel, and then everything fell quiet. I sank into the old wooden chair, gripping the armrest until my hand hurt. For the first time in my life, I was afraid of my son, not because he could hurt me physically, but because I realized he could do something worse. Take away my right to own my life, while still believing he was doing the right thing. That night, after Daniel and Samantha left, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I sat on the wooden chair on the porch for a long time, until it was completely dark, until the sound of crickets rose from the edge of the forest behind the farm, not because I was thinking anything profound, but because my mind was empty. A strange feeling crept in, like missing a familiar step on a staircase and feeling your heart race as you realize something in your life has slipped out of place. I went inside, locked the door, made a cup of tea, and forgot to drink it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind tapping lightly against the window frame, wondering where I had gone wrong for my son to sit across from me and talk about my life like a project that needed to be optimized. Near dawn, I finally drifted off for a short while. When I woke, pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, and my phone vibrated softly on the bedside table. A message from Rachel. Rachel is my youngest daughter. She's been different from Daniel since childhood. Quieter, more observant. She works in education, not glamorous, not fond of arguing. Since Richard passed, Rachel has called me often, not to make polite inquiries, but to listen. I opened the message, thinking she was probably asking if I was okay after yesterday's meeting. "Mom, are you alone right now?" I replied immediately. "Yes, I'm at the farm. What's going on?" The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. After a long pause, Rachel finally texted back, "I don't know how to say this, but you need to know." My hands trembled slightly. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my back straightening instinctively. "Go ahead." The phone stayed silent for a few more seconds, then the screen lit up. I was accidentally added to a group chat, not a normal family group. I frowned. What group? The group name appeared in the screenshot Rachel sent. Care Plan, Mom. I read the name over and over. My heart slowed by one beat, as if my body were bracing itself for an impact. "Please read it," Rachel texted. "I'm sorry for sending this to you, but I can't take it anymore." I opened the image. The first message that hit me was from Samantha. "We need to agree on how to talk to her. Lately, she hasn't been as clear-minded as before." Not clear-minded. My ears rang, but I kept reading, line by line, the way people watch an accident unfold in slow motion, unable to look away. Daniel replied right after, "I feel the same. She overreacts and doesn't take suggestions well, very hard to work with." Work. That word again. Someone else in the group, I guessed a friend of Samantha's, asked, "Do we need legal advice? If this is about managing an elderly person's assets, there are a few options." Samantha replied, "I have a lawyer friend. She specializes in cases like this. When an older person lives alone, it's easy to argue they're no longer capable of managing things." I put the phone down on the bed, my hand covering my mouth. A chill ran straight down my spine. Not vague fear anymore, but clarity. Everything was starting to take shape. Yesterday's words on the porch weren't spontaneous. They were part of a carefully discussed plan. Rachel sent more screenshots. This time, Daniel's message. "If we start with sharing usage rights, she'll accept it more easily. Then we gradually take control. The key is making her believe it's for her own good." For her own good. Tears fell onto my phone screen. Not loud, dramatic tears, but the kind that come when you no longer have the strength to react. I had prepared myself to be misunderstood, to be seen as stubborn. But I had never imagined my son sitting in a group chat discussing how to gradually control me like a problem to be managed. There was another message from Samantha, longer and more detailed. "She's emotionally attached to the farm, so we need to separate emotion from decision-making. If necessary, we can note that she's not as stable as before. This is for everyone's long-term safety." Long-term safety. I let the phone fall to my side and leaned back against the wall. The familiar room suddenly felt foreign. The photos on the walls, Richard and me, the kids when they were little, seemed to look back at me as if asking how I had ended up here. Rachel texted again, "Mom, I don't agree with this. I said so in the group, but they brushed it off. I'm scared for you." I took a deep breath, even though my chest ached. "Thank you for telling me," I typed back. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I'm sorry," Rachel wrote. "I feel like I betrayed you by being in that group." "No," I typed slowly. "You're the only one telling the truth." I set the phone down on the table and walked to the window. Morning sunlight stretched across the fields, over the rows of trees Richard and I had planted together. Everything was still there, solid, as if it had never been placed on a scale. Only I was unsteady. I sat down in the armchair in the living room, feeling as though all my strength had been drained at once. For a few minutes, I let myself collapse. I cried, without holding back, without shame. I cried for my husband who was gone, for the son I thought I knew, for myself, for being naive enough to believe that family bonds were strong enough to protect me from cold calculations. But in that very moment of weakness, something else appeared. Not anger, but a sharp, cold clarity. The pieces slid into place. Samantha's words, her calculating looks, Daniel's changes, the proposal to share usage rights. Nothing was vague anymore. They were the first steps of a clear plan to turn me into someone without decision-making power on my own land. I wiped my tears and took another deep breath. My hands no longer shook. A different kind of silence settled in, not the emptiness of shock, but the stillness of awareness. I realized something painful. Once someone decides you're no longer clear-minded, everything you say afterward can be used against you. Emotional reactions become loss of control. Silence becomes lack of awareness. Anything can be twisted to fit their narrative. I picked up my phone again and texted Rachel. "Leave that group," she replied instantly. "Mom." "Leave it," I repeated. "And don't argue anymore. I don't want you pulled into this." "What are you going to do?" Rachel asked. I looked out at the fields again. "I can't say yet, but I won't let them decide for me." I turned off the phone and sat still for a long time. No more tears, no more panic, just one clear, frighteningly bright thought. If they were planning step by step to take control of my life, then I had to stay one step ahead. And I knew that from this moment on, I could no longer act like a mother, guided only by emotion. I had to act like a woman who understood her own value, her own rights. That mental breakdown hadn't weakened me. It had stripped away the last layer of innocence I was still holding on to. I didn't want a war, but I wouldn't let anyone turn me into a bystander in my own life. For the first time since Richard passed away, I felt truly clear-minded, and that clarity told me one thing. If I didn't protect myself now, there wouldn't be another chance. After that night, I didn't cry again. Not because the pain disappeared, but because I understood this clearly. Tears wouldn't help me hold on to anything. They would only make me look weaker in the eyes of people already prepared to use that weakness as evidence against me. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Oregon was still wrapped in a thin layer of mist, the field in front of the house hazy like a painting. I made coffee, no sugar, no cream, and drank it slowly. For the first time in days, my hands didn't shake. My thoughts were arranged in a new order, cold but clear. I knew what I needed to do. The first thing I did wasn't calling Daniel, and it wasn't talking to Samantha. I called someone Richard had introduced me to years ago, someone I never thought I'd need, a lawyer who specialized in asset protection and elder rights. His office was in Salem, more than an hour's drive from my farm. I didn't make an appointment by phone. I drove there directly, parked, and walked in like any ordinary woman seeking advice. Nothing more. I didn't cry. I didn't rant. I didn't waste a single word. He was in his early 50s, hair streaked with gray, voice deep and unhurried. He let me finish without interrupting, nodding occasionally. I showed him the screenshots Rachel had sent, the messages Daniel and Samantha never thought I would see. He read them carefully. When he finished, he looked up at me. There was no pity in his eyes, only confirmation. "Mrs. Maggie," he said. "This isn't a normal family conflict." I stayed silent. These are very clear signs of financial and psychological abuse of an older adult. They're gradually building a narrative that you're no longer capable of managing your life and your assets. I nodded. "That's what I thought too." He frowned slightly, perhaps surprised that I didn't react more strongly. "The most important thing right now," he continued, "is that you don't give them any evidence against you. No loud arguments, no emotional reactions in front of them, and absolutely do not sign anything." "I won't," I said. He leaned back in his chair. "You're clear-minded, independent, and fully legally competent. But if they want to pursue a legal route, they'll try to make you look unstable. You need to prepare." Prepare. That was the word I'd been waiting for. I left the lawyer's office with a checklist forming neatly in my mind, like a plan. Not a plan for revenge, but a plan for protection. And I decided I wouldn't tell anyone about it. I started with the smallest things. That night, I took screenshots of every message and saved them to a separate hard drive, then backed them up to the cloud. I labeled dates, times, sender names, no detail missed. I didn't reread them over and over. I didn't need to hurt myself again. I just needed them to exist, intact as truth. 2 days later, I called a locksmith from the neighboring town. Not someone the family knew, not someone who had ever fixed Daniel's locks before. A stranger, efficient, quiet. I changed every lock. The front door, the back door, the barn, the old horse shed. Daniel used to have a key to just in case. When the locksmith asked, "Do you want extra keys for family?" I simply smiled, "No." That night, when I turned the new key in the lock and heard the sharp click, I felt something small but essential return to me: control. Then came the cameras. I didn't install big, obvious ones. I chose small cameras with no indicator lights, placed in corners outsiders wouldn't notice, but that covered every critical area: the entrance, the porch, the barn, and the dirt road leading from the gate into the farm. I paid in cash, used no card, left no easy trail. Throughout all of this, I told no one, not Rachel, not my neighbors, certainly not Daniel. I still answered my son's calls when he phoned, my voice normal, neither cold nor warm. I didn't mention the porch conversation or the secret group chat. Daniel seemed surprised by my silence. He made small talk. I answered briefly. Samantha didn't call. She sent one very polite message. "How have you been lately?" I didn't reply right away. I waited a day, then answered, "Fine." One word. The lawyer had told me, "Don't confront them directly. People making plans like this are often confident in their own cleverness. They'll make a mistake soon." And I believed him. I started observing more, not with emotion, but with clarity. I remembered the times Samantha had asked about land deeds, insurance, whether anyone else was listed on the property. Before, I'd thought it was just curiosity. Now every question had a different meaning. I took notes, brief, just dates, times, key points, like a professional, not a wounded mother. Some nights I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart still aching. I didn't pretend I was fine, but I didn't let the pain control my actions anymore. I thought of Richard. If he were still alive, what would he do? He wouldn't yell, he wouldn't beg. He would stand quietly, wait for the right moment, then act decisively. So would I. One afternoon, while walking along the western fence line, I noticed fresh tire tracks on the dirt path leading into the farm, not deep, but new. I stood there for a long time, not angry, just attentive. The cameras would tell me more. That evening, I checked the system. Nothing unusual yet, but I knew if they believed I'd softened, they would soon test another step. Maybe an unannounced visit, maybe a family talk with a third party, or a gentle legal move presented as help. I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't need to stay far ahead. I just needed to stand still and let them walk into the space they thought was safe. The trap wasn't something dramatic. It was patience. It was not reacting when they expected me to, not stopping them when they believed they were advancing. I didn't cry anymore, not because I was tougher, but because I understood this clearly. If I broke down, they would call it evidence. If I stood firm, they would eventually reveal who they really were. And I was ready to wait, not for revenge, but to protect my life on the very land where I had lived, loved, and would never surrender to anyone through silence. I didn't learn about it through a phone call, and no one said it to my face. I learned the most painful way possible, through the security camera system I had installed myself. That morning started out completely ordinary. Oregon's sky was a rare, clear blue, the air light, the scent of damp grass from the night's rain still lingering. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop to check email, and out of habit, I opened the camera system. Not because I suspected anything, but because it had become part of my new awareness. And then I saw them. Daniel's SUV appeared first, rolling slowly through the gate. I froze, my hand still on the mouse. Daniel hadn't told me he was coming to the farm today. My heart tightened slightly, but I tried to reassure myself. Maybe he was just stopping by to pick something up or check on something. 5 minutes later, a small truck carrying tables and chairs arrived. Then another with the logo of a local catering service. I sat up straight. The unease spread quickly, cold and unmistakable. The camera on the porch showed Samantha stepping out of the car, a light-colored dress, oversized sunglasses, moving with the confidence of someone who believed this place belonged to her. She pointed, said something to the delivery crew, and laughed loudly. I couldn't hear the sound, but I didn't need to. The way she stood there in the middle of my porch said everything. I looked at the clock. 10 a.m. My phone didn't vibrate. Not a single text. Not a single call. Not one word to remind me that today was Daniel's birthday. Not one word to say they were preparing to do something. Right here, on my farm. I opened another camera, the one in the backyard. Tables and chairs were being set up around the yard. String lights were being hung on the wooden posts Richard had built. Ice chests, speakers, decorations. Everything was arranged quickly and professionally, as if they had done this many times before. And I wasn't invited. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. I sat motionless in front of the screen, my heart pounding so heavily I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. A part of me still clung to the most unreasonable hope. Maybe they would call me later. Maybe this was just preparation. Maybe I was misunderstanding everything. Then the camera caught Samantha lifting her phone, turning around to take a wide shot of the farm. A few seconds later, my phone buzzed softly. A social media notification appeared. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from, but I opened it anyway. The first photo showed Daniel and Samantha standing in front of the porch, sunlight slanting across them, looking like a perfect couple. The caption underneath was short, cheerful, and sharp as a blade. Celebrating my love's birthday at our home. So grateful for this place and the life we're building. Our home. I read it 3 times. Each time the words scraped at my eyes. Not a single line mentioned me. Not one word said this was his mother's farm. Not a single trace that I existed in that story. I went back to the cameras. Guests were starting to arrive. People laughing, hugging Daniel, wishing him a happy birthday. Samantha stood beside him like the hostess, directing, greeting, her hand resting possessively on Daniel's back. And Daniel, my son, was smiling. He smiled easily, naturally, as if nothing were missing, as if the woman who gave birth to him, raised him, and held on to this land with her entire life didn't exist. My chest tightened, a familiar pain, but deeper this time, slower. I stood up, went into the bedroom, closed the door, and sat down on the edge of the bed. For the first time in many days, I allowed myself to cry. There were no sobs, no wailing, just tears flowing quietly, soaking the collar of my shirt. I cried for my absence on my son's birthday. I cried for the moment I realized I had been erased from a picture I had once painted myself. I cried for Richard. If he were still alive, this would never have happened. Not because he controlled things, but because he was the boundary. And when he died, that boundary disappeared with him. I cried exactly once. When the tears ran dry, I sat still for a long time. No more trembling, no more choking in my throat. Just a cold emptiness, like the aftermath of a violent storm. I stood up, washed my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red, but my gaze had changed. I returned to the living room and opened the cameras again. The party was in full swing. Music was playing. Glasses were raised. Someone clapped and called Daniel up to speak. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw him lift his glass, say a few sentences, and then everyone laughed. No one asked, "Where's his mother?" No one wondered why the true owner of the farm wasn't there. Samantha posted another story. This time, a slow-motion video of people clinking glasses under twinkling lights. The text across the bottom read, "Making memories at our place." Our memories, our place. I turned off the screen, not because I couldn't take it anymore, but because I had seen enough. That afternoon, I didn't go outside. I sat at my desk, opened my notebook, and for the first time, I wasn't writing to remember. I was writing to plan. Not a plan fueled by anger, but a deliberate, public counteraction that couldn't be denied. I wrote bullet points slowly, carefully. I thought about what the lawyer had said. Let them feel confident. Let them take another step. And I realized they had just taken a very big one. Hosting a party on my property without permission, without my presence. Publicly declaring it our home. That was no longer a family matter. That was evidence. I opened my computer and saved every post, every story, every image. I took screenshots, recorded dates and times, saved links. I reviewed the camera footage, marking each frame. Vehicles entering the gate, tables being set up, guests arriving, Samantha directing, Daniel making a speech. Every piece fell into place. When night came, I sat alone in the quiet house. Outside, the party was probably still going. Laughter might have been ringing out, but it no longer reached me. Something inside me had closed, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. I was no longer the mother standing on the sidelines, painfully watching her son be led astray. I was no longer the woman afraid of being labeled not clear-minded. From the moment I saw the words, "our home," on that screen, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer, not to reclaim affection, but to reclaim the truth. That year, Daniel's birthday passed without his mother, and it was also the day I officially began preparing for the moment when everything would be called by its proper name. In front of everyone, publicly, clearly, and without turning back. The second party didn't come as a surprise, the way I might have expected. It came exactly the way people used to, taking other people's space, tend to act. Confident, loud, and convinced there would be no consequences. I found out about it 2 days earlier, not from Daniel, and certainly not from Samantha. I learned through the cameras and through a stray message from an old acquaintance in town. I heard there's going to be another big party at Maggie's son's farm this weekend. Another party. I didn't reply. I didn't ask for details. I just sat by the window for a long time, watching the sunset fall over the fields. Late summer Oregon was gentler, the wind carrying the scent of dry soil and pine needles. A scene so peaceful that anyone looking in would never imagine that, inside me, a silent trial was being prepared. I didn't interfere. I didn't call. I didn't send a message asking them to stop. I let everything unfold exactly the way they wanted, because that night I didn't plan to play the role of a mother anymore. I planned to play the role of the owner. That afternoon I prepared carefully. Not fancy clothes, just a dark jacket, low shoes, a fully charged phone. I checked the camera system, the speakers, the backup power. Everything was ready. I wasn't nervous. That surprised me the most. The trembling had vanished, replaced by a cold calm. I left the house at dusk, not through the main gate, but along the Western Service Road, the one only Richard and I had used back when we were first clearing the land. A narrow path, overgrown with trees, enough for a car to pass without drawing attention. I parked near the old barn, where the party lights didn't reach. From there I could hear the music echoing, laughter, the clinking of glasses. More people than last time, louder, more confident. I opened the camera app on my phone. The yard was brightly lit, lights everywhere, tables filled. I counted quickly, more than 80 people. Some unfamiliar faces, some people I had once known who had come to my house for tea, now standing there as guests in a place that wasn't theirs. Samantha appeared on screen in a light dress, her hair carefully styled, a glass of wine in her hand. She moved through the crowd like a host, smiling, hugging guests, gesturing toward the main house. And Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back, wearing that familiar smile that now felt distant. Not once during the minutes I watched did he glance toward the house where I was, as if he had decided I no longer belonged in this picture. I took one deep breath, not to gather courage, but to mark the final moment of hesitation. I looked at the clock. 10:58 p.m. I waited. I waited until the music was at its loudest, the laughter at its peak, when people had had enough to drink to be less alert, but not enough to lose control. I waited until Samantha stepped onto the porch, clapping her hands to get everyone's attention. Through the camera, I saw her raise her glass. Her lips moved as she spoke, maybe a speech, maybe something about family, about home, about memories. 11 p.m. exactly. I tapped the screen. The entire farm's power shut off. Not section by section, not flickering. Total darkness. For the first second, there was absolute silence. The kind you only hear when all your senses are stripped away at once. Then the screaming started, overlapping, panicked. What's happening? Is the power out? Does anyone have a flashlight? Chairs fell. Glass shattered. People tripped. Someone shouted after being pushed off the porch steps. Water splashed from the pool. I waited another 10 seconds, long enough for fear to spread like a wave. Then I turned on the speaker system. The voice came through, low, slow, processed through a filter. Not the voice of a mother, not the voice of someone familiar, the voice of ownership. This farm has an owner. The screaming stopped abruptly, as if someone had squeezed the crowd's collective throat. You are currently on private property without permission. I heard someone swear. Someone else started crying. Samantha shouted, "Who's doing this? Is this some kind of joke?" I didn't answer right away. Everything happening right now, the voice continued, is being recorded. Time, images, audio. A new wave of panic swept through. People began pushing toward the exit, but in the dark, no one knew which path was safe. Voices called out, feet ran, objects crashed to the ground. "Please leave the area immediately," the voice continued, calm, steady. "The police have been notified." That was when I turned on the lights at the main porch, just enough so people could see where I was standing. I stepped out of the darkness, not rushing, not shaking, not hiding. I stood upright, hands folded in front of me, the light falling across my face. Some people recognized me instantly. I saw their eyes widen, confusion spreading. "That's Maggie." "The farm owner?" Samantha froze. The wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the wooden floor. Daniel turned toward me, his face drained of color, his mouth opening but no words coming out. "I am the legal owner of this farm," I said, this time without the speakers, in my real voice clear in the terrifying silence. "And none of you have the right to host events here without my permission." A few people stammered apologies. Some lowered their heads and quietly left, but Samantha didn't. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but defiant. "What are you doing? You're scaring everyone." "I'm protecting my property," I replied. "You've used it repeatedly without authorization." "Daniel is your son," Samantha yelled. "We're family." "Family does not mean taking," I said, not looking at her, but straight at Daniel. "You know that." Daniel lowered his head. At that moment, red and blue lights flashed at the gate. The sound of a police car cut through the night, clear, undeniable. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I called the police," I said, "and I will be reporting the trespassing." Samantha turned to Daniel, her voice urgent. "Say something." Daniel stayed silent. For the first time, he didn't step in to shield her. When the police arrived, I explained everything clearly and briefly. Proof of ownership, camera footage, evidence of unauthorized use, no extra emotion, no personal attacks. Samantha argued. She talked about misunderstandings, about family, about good intentions. But under the lights, in front of dozens of people who had just witnessed the chaos, her words sounded hollow. The mask didn't fall with a blow. It fell under light, the light of truth. When the last guests left, the farmyard grew eerily quiet. I stood there, watching the lights come back on, listening to the wind move through the trees. That night there was no laughter, no music, only a heavy silence. But this time, it belonged to me. The night of judgment was over, and everyone knew clearly this was not our home. This was mine. The police stayed at the farm for nearly an hour after the crowd had dispersed. They worked calmly and professionally, favoring no one. I sat on the wooden chair on the porch, a light jacket over my shoulders, answering each question in a steady, clear voice. My name, my address, proof of ownership. The moment I discovered the unauthorized use, I added nothing, left nothing out. I simply told the truth, precise and complete. One younger officer took notes while the other checked documents. When they confirmed that the farm was in my name, that there was no rental agreement or authorization of any kind, the atmosphere shifted. This was no longer an awkward family misunderstanding. It was a clear case of trespassing. A report was written on the spot. Samantha wouldn't stay still. She paced back and forth, her voice rising as she tried to draw attention back to herself. "You don't understand," she said. "She's not normal anymore. She acts erratically, locking doors, cutting the power. We're just trying to help her." Crazy old woman, I heard the accusation without her having to say it outright. It hovered in her eyes, in the careful way she chose her words. She was trying to paint me as unstable, so everything I had done would look like a sudden outburst. I didn't react. The older officer looked up and met Samantha's gaze. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "we see no indication that Mrs. Maggie lacks capacity. On the contrary, she's been very clear. What we do see is an event held on private property without permission, which is a violation." Samantha froze. Daniel stood a few steps away, his face pale. He looked at me, then at the officers, then at Samantha, as if he were realizing for the first time that there was no one left to stand between him and the consequences. "Say something," Samantha urged him, her voice lower now but frantic. "Tell them." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. I saw the collapse in my son's eyes, not fear of the police, but the crumbling of the wall he had trusted, the belief that everything will work out. There was nowhere left to hide. The officers finished the paperwork and handed me a copy of the report. "Do you want to pursue this further?" one of them asked. "I will follow the law," I replied. That was enough. No bitterness, no threats, just clarity. When the police cars drove away, the farm fell silent again. Samantha lingered for a few minutes, as if waiting for something to change. Nothing did. Finally, she turned and walked quickly toward the car, her heels striking sharply against the gravel. No goodbye, no final glance, just a hurried, humiliating retreat. Daniel stayed behind. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely. "I didn't think it would go this far." I looked at my son for a long time. I didn't feel the surge of anger I once had. I felt only a deep exhaustion. "You didn't think," I said slowly, "but you allowed it." Daniel lowered his head. His shoulders sagged as if under a weight he had never carried before. I didn't comfort him. I didn't accuse him further. Any words now would have been unnecessary. I went inside, got some water, took a small sip. When I returned to the porch, Daniel was still standing there in silence. "You should go home," I said. "That's enough for tonight." He nodded and walked away without looking back. The next morning, I drove into town and went straight to the lawyer's office. I placed the police report on his desk, along with the evidence I had prepared earlier: screenshots, camera footage, social media posts. He reviewed everything carefully, then looked up and nodded. "You have a very solid case," he said. "If you want, we can file a formal complaint." "I want to," I replied. Not for revenge, not to intimidate, but because I needed a boundary recognized by law, one that couldn't be bent by sweet words or vague accusations. I signed my name, each stroke of the pen firm and final. From the lawyer's office, I went straight to the notary. I brought my old will and read every line. It had been written at a time when I believed family bonds were enough to keep everything safe. I realized I had been wrong, not because I loved my children, but because I hadn't set limits. I rewrote my will, not long-winded, not emotional. I divided everything clearly and transparently with clauses that protected my assets and my right to make decisions until my very last day. I didn't do it in anger. I did it in complete clarity. That afternoon, I called Daniel. He came, quieter than ever before. We sat facing each other in the living room, sunlight slanting through the window. I didn't beat around the bush. "You are still my son," I said, "but from today on, there will be boundaries." Daniel looked up, his eyes red. "I understand." "You have no right to use the farm without my written permission," I continued. "No events, no rentals, no managing on my behalf. And any discussion related to my assets must go through a lawyer." Daniel nodded without objecting. "This is not a punishment," I added. "This is a boundary. Justice is not revenge. Justice is putting everything back where it belongs." He stayed silent for a long time, then said softly, "I was wrong." I didn't say, "It's okay." I didn't say, "I forgive you." I only said, "From now on, you need to learn how to respect." When Daniel left, I stood alone in the quiet house. No more forced laughter, no more party lights, just the sound of wind across the fields and the familiar scent of old wood. I didn't feel victorious. I felt lighter. Justice doesn't bring joy. It brings an upright spine. And for the first time in a very long while, I knew one thing for certain. I no longer had to protect my life with emotions. I had placed it exactly where it belonged, into my own hands and under the light of the law. After that night, things didn't end quickly the way people often imagine when they hear the word justice. There was no bold full stop, no applause, only quiet, gradual consequences that could not be avoided. Daniel didn't speak to me for many weeks. I didn't call him. He didn't call me either. That silence was different from our previous distances. This time, it didn't carry tension, but a heavy emptiness, as if a layer had been stripped away and the person underneath didn't yet know how to stand firmly. I learned about Daniel's marriage not from him, but from Rachel. She called me one evening during a light rain, her voice cautious. "Mom, Daniel and Samantha are living separately." I was silent for a few seconds, not because I was surprised, but because I needed to be sure I'd heard correctly. "When?" I asked. "A few weeks now," Rachel replied. "Everything is messy. Samantha moved out almost immediately after the police incident. I turned off the stove and sat down in a chair. Inside me, there was none of the satisfaction people often expect in moments like that. No joy, just a very deep sigh, like when you watch a house collapse and realize it had been cracking for a long time. Later on, Daniel told me himself in a brief phone conversation. His voice sounded tired, stripped of its usual confidence. "She said I betrayed her," he said. "She said I didn't stand by her when she needed me." "And you?" I asked. He was silent for a long time. I don't know whose side I was on all this time. That marriage didn't fall apart because of a power outage, and not because of the police. It fell apart because the truth was pulled into the light, and that light didn't shine only on Samantha, it shone straight on to Daniel. In the months that followed, pieces of the story surfaced one by one. Expenses Daniel had never paid attention to, accounts in Samantha's name, but funded with shared money. Investments he believed were for the future, which turned out to be nothing more than fuel for a glamorous image. Daniel called me one afternoon, his voice unsteady. "Mom, did you know? I paid off almost all of her credit card debt. I thought it was for work, for her personal brand. But there was nothing." I didn't say, "I warned you." I didn't need to prove I was right. I only asked one question. "What do you see now?" He answered very quietly, "I see that I was used." From then on, Daniel began trying to make amends, not with grand apologies, but with awkward, clumsy actions. He emailed to ask if I needed help fixing the fence. He texted to ask if I was okay when the weather turned cold. Once, he left a crate of dry firewood on the Yee's porch and drove away without knocking. I saw everything, but I didn't rush to respond. Not because I wanted to punish my son, but because I had learned a lesson that was far too costly. Words can be beautiful, but only time and actions reveal the truth. Daniel asked to see me several times. I refused the first two. The third time, I said, "Not yet." He didn't argue. He only replied, "I understand." I observed. I didn't ask about his personal life. I didn't interfere. I let my son walk through the consequences of choices he had once believed were right. And in that silence, I realized something. Daniel was beginning to change, not because he lost Samantha, but because for the first time in his life, he had no one left to blame. 6 months passed. Winter came and went. Snow melted slowly across the fields. Trees began to bud again. The farm entered spring with a different kind of calm, no longer disrupted by plans, gossip, or scrutinizing eyes. I lived at my own pace, woke early, tended the garden, read books, called Rachel. The days weren't dramatic, but they were steady. Daniel kept his distance. He didn't come to the farm. He didn't ask about documents. He didn't mention anything related to usage rights or management. He went to work, handled his own life. Rachel told me he had moved into a smaller apartment and sold the expensive car Samantha had once been so proud of. One early spring morning, while I was trimming rose bushes by the porch, I received a text from Daniel. Just one sentence. "Are you doing okay, Mom?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied, "I am." 2 words, just like the way I once replied to Samantha. But this time, I wasn't closing the door. A week later, I texted Daniel again. "If you'd like, you can come back for dinner this weekend." The typing indicator appeared for a long time. Then he replied, "I'd really like that, but I don't know if you're sure." "Saturday night," I wrote. 6 p.m. Daniel arrived right on time. Not early, not late. He stood on the porch holding a small bouquet, not expensive flowers, just wild flowers neatly tied together. When I opened the door, he looked at me like someone stepping into a place he had once hurt. "Thank you, Mom," he said. Dinner unfolded slowly. No one mentioned Samantha. No one mentioned the lawsuit. We talked about simple things. Daniel's job, the weather, the garden. There were silences, but they weren't uncomfortable. Just the necessary caution of 2 people learning how to speak again from the beginning. After dinner, we sat on the porch. The sky darkened. The lights inside the house came on. Daniel looked out across the field, then turned to me. "I know things will never be the same again," he said. "Good," I replied, "because the way things were wasn't okay." He nodded without arguing. "I don't expect you to forget. I just hope for a chance to do things right." I looked at my son carefully. Not to search for the child he once was, but to see the man sitting in front of me with all his mistakes and lessons. "Everything has to start over," I said. "Not from feelings, but from respect." "I understand," Daniel said. That night, when Daniel left, I stood alone on the porch, listening to the sound of his car fade away. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel relieved either. I felt right where I belonged. The price had been paid, not through someone's collapse, but through real change, slow and painful. And I knew that if Daniel wanted to remain in my life, he would have to walk that path on his own 2 feet, not like before, but as a new beginning, with clear boundaries and truth no longer hidden. The next meeting between Daniel and me didn't come long after that first dinner. There was no formal invitation, no elaborate preparation. One morning, he simply texted me, "Do you have time for coffee?" I stared at that message for a long time, not because I hesitated, but because I realized I was no longer afraid of that question. We met at a small cafe in town, a place Richard and I used to stop whenever we went to buy supplies for the farm. Daniel arrived a few minutes early. He stood up when he saw me walk in, a little awkward, unsure whether he should hug me or just say hello. I nodded and sat down. The air between us was still cautious, but no longer heavy. We talked slowly. Daniel told me about his job, his new apartment, about nights spent learning how to be alone after years of being used to someone else's voice. I listened without interrupting. There were long silences, but I didn't rush to fill them. I had learned that silence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's where truth reveals itself. Finally, Daniel looked straight at me. "Mom," he said, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness right away, but I want to say I'm sorry. Not just for what happened, but for not seeing you as an independent person." I looked at my son for a long time. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the need to list old wounds. I saw someone who had fallen, slowly getting back up and knowing exactly where he had gone wrong. "I forgive you," I said, "but I don't forget." Daniel nodded. He didn't expect me to forget, and I didn't want to, because memory is the boundary that keeps things from repeating themselves. Forgiveness, to me, isn't erasing what happened. It's accepting it as part of my life and moving forward without letting it define me. My will remained unchanged. I made that clear, and Daniel didn't object. He understood that some decisions no longer belonged to emotion, but to protection. I didn't rewrite my will to punish anyone, nor to hurt anyone. I wrote it to remind myself that my life, until my very last breath, is still mine. The farm gradually returned to its original meaning. No more loud parties, no more glittering lights for show. Just the wind, the smell of soil, and a familiar rhythm. I fixed a few small corners, not to upgrade, but to care for them. I planted another row of trees on the western side, where the afternoon light is gentlest. Every morning, I walk around the farm not to control it, but to feel it. Some afternoons, Daniel stops by, never unannounced, always asking first. He helps me mend a fence, replace a rotten board. We work side by side, speaking little, doing more. No old roles, no old expectations, just two adults learning how to be close in a new way. In those quiet moments, I found myself again, not the mother who must always sacrifice, and not the woman who has to prove anything. I am simply me, a person who has walked through loss, betrayal, fear, and stood firm. I returned to reading, to journaling, to learning how to say no without guilt. I understood that love should never come with the cost of losing oneself. The greatest lesson I carry isn't how to protect assets, but how to protect boundaries. Loving does not mean enduring. Family is not a place where you must stay silent when you are hurt. True peace doesn't come from pleasing everyone. It comes from living in alignment with your values. I chose a peaceful life, but one with limits. I open the door, but I don't remove the lock. I allow others to step in, but I don't allow anyone to take control. And within that balance, my heart feels much lighter. Evenings are quiet now. I sit on the porch, watching the sun sink over the fields. The light at the end of the day isn't dazzling, but it's warm. It doesn't erase the darkness that came before, but it's enough for me to clearly see the road ahead. If you've stayed with me to these final lines, I want to pause for a moment, not to tell more of my story, but to listen to yours. Each life, especially in the second half of the journey, carries losses, silences, and moments when we ask ourselves, am I living true to my values? If somewhere in this story you caught a glimpse of yourself, a mother, a father, someone who loved too much and endured too long, then you are not alone. Please tell me where you're listening to this story from. a big city, a small town, or a quiet corner of the world. If you've ever stood at the boundary between love and self-respect, I invite you to share a few thoughts in the comments. I read every word, and I value every story entrusted to me. If this story gave you even a little strength, a little courage, or simply the feeling of being understood, please tap the like button to help pass that feeling on to others. And if you'd like to continue walking with me through stories about family, boundaries, and late but necessary awakenings, please subscribe and stay tuned for the next episodes. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for staying until this moment. Your presence is the gentlest light after years of darkness. I still remember that sound clearly. The door slammed shut behind me, not because of the wind, but because my own daughter pushed it hard. The snow was falling so heavily I couldn't see the end of the street. I stood there, my hands trembling from the cold, while she spoke in a voice as calm as if she were reading a utility bill. I can't support another person who no longer earns money. I raised her alone for more than 30 years, and in just one white, snow-filled afternoon, I was erased from her life like an expense that was no longer necessary. But in that very moment, I didn't cry. I did something my daughter and the entire world never expected. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 63 years old, born and raised in the state of Ohio. My entire life has been tied to bitter winter mornings, salt-covered roads, and a rhythm so steady many people would call it boring. I was never a woman with grand dreams. All I wanted was a peaceful life, a warm home, an honest job, and a child raised properly. For 32 years, I worked at the same insurance company in Columbus. I started there when my hair was still black, when Lauren was just learning to walk. I stayed until gray crept in and my back began to ache whenever the weather turned cold. I was always there 15 minutes early, making coffee before work, organizing paperwork for the whole team. I remembered every co-worker's name, their birthdays, even the names of children I'd never met but had heard about for years. I believed in something very American, very old-fashioned. If you work hard and stay loyal, you will be treated fairly. I believed dedication mattered. I believed age was experience, not a burden. Until that Friday afternoon, my supervisor called me into the office with a politeness so cold it sent a chill through me. "Evelyn, we need to talk." I already knew what was coming. Over the past 2 months, older women in the department had been disappearing one by one. Desks emptied out. Potted plants were removed without explanation. They used the word restructuring. They said it had nothing to do with performance. They placed a thin envelope in front of me. 2 weeks of severance. 2 weeks of pay for more than 30 years of service. I signed the papers with a hand that was strangely calm, thanked them for the opportunity, and walked out of the building like a polite visitor who had simply wandered into the wrong place. On the bus ride home, I watched familiar shops slide past the fogged-up windows. I thought about Lauren. I thought about how I would tell her, not because I was afraid she'd be angry, but because I knew she was more worried about money than ever. I had lived with Lauren's family for nearly 5 years. After my husband passed away, and after I sold my small apartment to help her with the down payment on the house. Back then, Lauren cried, hugged me, and said, "Mom, you're my lifesaver." I believed her. I believed family was a safe place. Lauren's house was in a quiet neighborhood, rows of similar homes with neatly trimmed lawns. I walked in and took off my shoes like always. Jason was on the couch, a can of beer in his hand, eyes fixed on a basketball game I didn't care about. He nodded at me but said nothing. My 2 grandchildren ran out of the living room. "Grandma!" They wrapped their arms around my legs, the familiar scent of children's soap softening my heart. It was the only moment that day when I still felt like I belonged. Lauren was in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice tight. I caught fragments. Payment? Past due? Just 1 more week. When she hung up, her shoulders sagged. I stood there, my purse still in my hand, and said the sentence I had practiced the entire bus ride. "Lauren, I lost my job today." She turned to look at me. First came surprise, then very quickly her expression changed. Not worry, not sympathy, calculation, as if an invisible spreadsheet had appeared in front of her eyes. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice rising. I repeated it slowly, explained. "They're restructuring. I have 2 weeks of severance. I'll look for another job." Lauren didn't answer right away. She sat down, fingers interlaced. "Do you know Jason is unemployed?" she said. "Do you know we haven't paid this month's mortgage yet?" I nodded. I had helped them so many times before, small amounts that grew larger and larger. I never asked for anything back. I thought that was what a mother did. "Then you understand," Lauren continued, her voice turning cold. "I can't take on any more." I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. "Take on?" I repeated. "Mom," she sighed, "you don't have income. I can't support another adult who doesn't earn money." The words fell between us like a heavy object. Jason never looked up. The TV kept blaring the cheers of the crowd. I stood there, looking at my daughter, the child I once held through sleepless nights, and I didn't recognize her anymore. Lauren avoided my eyes. "You should find somewhere else to stay for now," she said, "just temporarily. Once you get back on your feet, then—" Outside the window, snow began to fall. Big, heavy flakes covered the walkway in front of the house. The morning forecast had warned of a storm. I looked outside, then back at my daughter. "Now?" I asked. Lauren was silent for 1 second too long. Then she nodded very slightly. I went upstairs and packed a few necessities. I could hear the children laughing downstairs, unaware that their grandmother was being erased from their lives. When I pulled my suitcase to the door, Lauren was already standing there. She opened it. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't hug me. The door slammed shut, not because of the wind. I stood on the porch as snow began to settle on my shoulders. My breath turned to steam. And in that moment, I understood something painfully clear. I hadn't just lost my job. I had been pushed out of my own family. I didn't stand there long. The snow crept into my collar, the cold seeping through my old coat. I dragged my suitcase down the steps and walked slowly toward the curb, where yellow streetlights cast a glow over the white ground. Each step sounded soft, but inside my head, the noise was deafening. 30 years. The number kept repeating in my mind, steady as the ticking clock on the wall of my old office. 30 years, I was never late. 30 years, I never took a day off unless I was truly sick. 30 years, I believed that if I did things right, lived honestly, life wouldn't be too cruel. I remembered my first morning at that insurance company. I was in my early 30s. Lauren couldn't even read yet. I wore a light blue dress I bought on sale, lunch packed the night before. The office was small and outdated, but full of hope. I was the youngest woman there, always volunteering for the tasks no one wanted. I learned quickly. I took careful notes. I didn't complain. When the company changed systems, I stayed late to learn the new software. When coworkers went on maternity leave, I took on extra work without asking for more pay. I was proud of being reliable. There were days I left the office long after dark, rushing home to cook dinner for Lauren. I ate a few quick bites, then sat at the kitchen table reviewing paperwork for the next day. I never thought of it as sacrifice. I thought it was simply the duty of a mother, of an honest worker. I believed that so deeply I never questioned it, until the past few years when things began to change, quietly, slowly, like cold air slipping through a crack you don't notice at first. Familiar faces disappeared. Patricia, who sat across from me for more than 20 years, was let go early. Linda, who brought homemade cookies every Friday, vanished after a closed-door meeting. They were all older. They all had the same confused look as they packed their things. At first, I reassured myself, maybe they retired willingly. Maybe the company gave them a package. I didn't want to think further. Then it was my turn. No thank you, no apology. Just a thin envelope and 2 weeks of severance. 2 weeks for 30 years. I held that envelope and felt no anger, only emptiness, as if someone had erased a part of my life with a few printed words. Standing outside my daughter's house, snow falling around my feet, I finally understood what it felt like to be discarded by society. No one says, "You're useless." All the doors just close at once. When you're young, they call you potential. When you're middle-aged, they call you experience. When you grow old, all they see is cost. I no longer had economic value. That was the cold truth I faced that afternoon. I sat down on the bus bench near Lauren's house. The stop was empty, snow piling up on the metal roof. I set my suitcase at my feet, hands resting on my knees, and for the first time in my life, I felt afraid. Not a passing fear, but a deep, slow fear that took root. I was afraid of old age without money, afraid of waking up one day with nowhere to belong, afraid of having to beg, afraid of becoming exactly what my daughter had just called me, a person who no longer earns money. I thought about my old apartment, the one I sold to help Lauren buy this house. When I signed those papers, I smiled, believing I was investing in my child's future. I never kept a backup plan for myself. Back then, I believed family was the best insurance. I was wrong. The snow fell harder. The wind cut through my coat, making me shiver. And in that moment, images of Lauren as a child surfaced with painful clarity. She once had a high fever on a snowy night, and I carried her on foot to the emergency room because the car wouldn't start. She once sobbed when her father left, and I held her, promising I would never abandon her. She once told me as a teenager, "Mom, you're the strongest person I know." I had lived up to that promise. She hadn't. I didn't blame Lauren right then. I only asked myself over and over, like a needle that wouldn't stop pricking, where did I go wrong? Did I raise her too fragile when it came to money? Did I sacrifice so much that she stopped seeing the value of that sacrifice? Or did I teach everyone, by always putting myself last, that this was simply where I belonged? Those questions followed me through that long evening. When the last bus of the day arrived, I stepped on and took a seat by the window. Outside, lit-up houses passed in silence. Somewhere, families were sitting down to dinner, sharing small stories around the table. And there I was, 63 years old, jobless, homeless, and realizing that 30 years of loyalty were worth exactly 2 weeks of pay, and not even enough to keep me in my own daughter's house. I leaned my head against the cold glass and closed my eyes. There were no tears left, only a terrifying emptiness and a question with no answer yet. The bus stopped in front of a low, aging building tucked between 2 abandoned warehouses. The sign out front was faded by snow and time, only a few words still readable. Women's Transitional Shelter. I pulled my suitcase down, its wheels catching on the icy curb with a sharp clack that made my head ache. I stood in front of the heavy metal door for a few seconds, not because I hesitated, but because I needed a moment to accept the truth. 63 years old, I, Evelyn Carter, was about to step into a shelter for homeless women. The door opened with a long creak. Warm air mixed with the smell of disinfectant rushed into my face. Not the smell of a hospital, but the smell of places that try to cover exhaustion with cleanliness. A middle-aged woman behind the reception desk looked up, her eyes tired, but not unkind. She asked my name, my date of birth, and a few familiar questions, as if she had asked them hundreds of times before. When I answered, my voice was so calm it surprised even me, as if everything had crossed some invisible line where shame no longer had the power to make me tremble. Inside, the space was large but bare. Pale beige walls, fluorescent lights casting a cold glow, whispered conversations, slippers dragging on the floor, soft coughing, all blending into a steady, sorrowful hum. I looked around and realized something that tightened my chest. Many of the women here looked like me, not the images people usually imagine when they hear homeless. No madness, no torn clothes, just tired faces, eyes that once knew family dinner tables, living rooms with curtains, evenings watching the 6 o'clock news. A gray-haired woman sat clutching an old cloth bag. Another carefully folded a sweater as if it were the most valuable thing she owned. I saw pieces of myself in them, women who once had addresses, roles, people who called them family. I was led up an old metal staircase that creaked with every step. The hallway on the second floor was long and narrow, small windows fogged over. The staff member pointed to a bunk bed in the corner. "Bottom bunk," she said. "That window leaks a bit. Close the curtain if it gets cold." The bunk bed was metal, white paint chipped in places. The mattress was thin, the white sheet washed so many times it was worn. Near the window, a small gap let cold air slip in, carrying the chill of the snowy night. I set my suitcase beside the bed, sat on the edge, and felt the metal frame vibrate lightly under my weight. I had slept in better beds than this, many times, but I had never felt this lost. Night fell slowly. The hallway lights dimmed, leaving only a faint glow in the room. I lay there, pulling the blanket up to my chin, listening to the wind whistle through the crack in the window. Each gust made the curtain flutter, casting shifting shadows on the wall like nameless figures. I couldn't sleep. My eyes closed and opened again. Lauren's image kept appearing in my mind, not her cold face as she closed the door, but her as a little girl, hair in pigtails, grinning as she showed off a newly lost baby tooth. I thought about my grandchildren. I wondered if they would wake up in the morning and ask where Grandma was, or if they would quickly get used to her absence. That thought hurt more than the cold. I turned toward the wall, trying to stop the thoughts. But the feeling of being replaced crept in, persistent, as if I had finished my role and now there was no place for me anymore. I had been a mother, a model employee, someone people needed, and now I was just a bunk bed that could be filled by anyone else once I left. For a moment, I wondered if sacrificing so much had been a mistake, if keeping my apartment, keeping a little selfishness, might have changed everything. But those questions brought no answers, only made my chest feel heavier. A woman in the opposite bunk shifted in her sleep and let out a very soft sigh. That sound made me realize I wasn't alone in this loss. Everyone here had a story, a fall, a door that had been shut. I lay there for a long time, listening to my heartbeat slow down, and in that cold silence, another thought began to form, slowly but clearly. I had lost so much today, but I was still alive. I was still breathing, and if life had already pushed me all the way to the bottom like this, then at the very least, I had nothing left to lose. I turned my face toward the ceiling, staring at the faint cracks under the weak light. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I only whispered to myself, like a promise meant for no one else to hear. If I survive tonight, if I still have the strength to stand up tomorrow, I will never let anyone step on me again. Outside, the snow kept falling. But for the first time since the door at Lauren's house slammed shut, I felt something very small, very fragile inside me. Not hope, but clarity. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the light snapping on suddenly at 6 a.m. There was no alarm clock, no familiar smell of coffee, just the shuffling sound of slippers on the floor and a staff member's steady voice announcing breakfast. My body felt heavy as lead. I had barely slept the night before. Still, I sat up and carefully folded my blanket out of old habit, the habit of someone who once believed that small order could keep life from completely falling apart. After a simple breakfast of watery oatmeal and a weak cup of coffee, we were asked to line up at the end of the hallway. A small sign hung on the wall read, "Health screening, mandatory for new residents, mandatory health screening." I wasn't surprised. Places like this have to make sure there are no contagious diseases. I stood in line with the other women, all of us silent, eyes drifting without focus. Someone coughed dryly. Someone else clutched an old coat tightly, like a fragile layer of protection. The medical room was at the end of the first floor, small and so clean it felt out of place in the aging building. A few posters hung on the walls advising people to quit smoking, monitor blood pressure, eat healthy. Good advice, but it sounded like a luxury to people who didn't know where they'd sleep that night. When it was my turn, I walked in and sat on the plastic chair beside the exam table. The nurse looked up and smiled. Not overly cheerful, but genuine. That alone eased my tension a little. She introduced herself as Hannah Lewis, early 40s, brown hair neatly tied back, thin-framed glasses. Her eyes were calm, used to broken stories, but still gentle enough that I didn't feel like just another file. "We'll check your blood pressure, heart rate, and take a little blood for basic tests," she said, her voice even and soft. "Just routine." I nodded. I had no expectations at all. At my age, every test comes with a quiet fear: diabetes, heart disease, cancer. I had prepared myself to hear another piece of bad news. I think I believed I no longer had the strength to be surprised again. Hannah wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm. The numbers made her frown slightly before she wrote something down. "A bit high," she said. "Stress lately?" I gave a faint smile. "You could say that." She didn't ask more. Some answers don't need digging into. Then she prepared the needle. I turned my head to the side and stared at the poster in front of me. A smiling family around a dinner table, an image so familiar it hurt. The needle pierced my skin. A small, familiar sting. A small vial slowly filled with my blood. The dark red liquid that had flowed through me for more than 60 years, raised a child, carried me through countless working days. I had never thought about my blood that way. To me, it had always just existed, quiet, anonymous, like me for so many years. Hannah labeled the vial and wrote my name, Evelyn Carter. Seeing my name printed on that white label gave me a strange feeling, as if, for the first time in a long while, my name was attached to something specific. "We'll have the results in 1 or 2 days," she said. "If there's anything we need to look at, I'll let you know." I thanked her, stood up, and left the medical room without thinking much more about it. At that moment, my only simple thought was, I hope nothing serious shows up. The next 2 days crawled by. I went to the public library to stay warm and read newspapers. I scanned job listings, even though deep down I knew my age was an invisible wall. I returned to the shelter at night, ate dinner in silence, then lay back down on the bunk bed near the drafty window. On the 3rd day, as I was lining up for lunch, a staff member came looking for me. "Evelyn Carter," she called. "Nurse Hannah would like to see you." My heart tightened. In that instant, I thought, this is it. I followed her down to the medical room, each step heavier than the last. Hannah was standing by the desk, flipping through a folder. When she saw me, she looked up, and right then, I noticed something unusual. Not worry, not pity, but hesitation. She pulled out a chair and motioned for me to sit. "Evelyn," she began, slower than usual, "I need to talk to you about your test results." I clasped my hands tightly on my lap. "Is something wrong?" I asked, bracing myself for the familiar words. Hannah took a breath. "Not in the way you're thinking," she said. "Actually, your results are quite unusual." I frowned. At my age, unusual is never a comforting word. "Your basic numbers are fine," Hannah continued. "But during the blood tests, we found that you have a very rare type of antibody." I looked at her, confused. "An antibody?" She nodded and explained briefly, just enough for me to follow. "Some people, very rare, have unique immune traits, and I, based on the initial results, might be one of them. We need to run more advanced tests to confirm," Hannah said. "But if it's true, your blood could help another patient." I let out a soft laugh, not because it was funny. "Are you saying I have some strange disease?" I asked. "Or that I'm about to—" "No," Hannah interrupted firmly. "You don't have a dangerous illness, at least not from what we can see." I exhaled, but I still didn't understand. "Then what is it?" Hannah looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing every word. "There's a patient at one of our partner hospitals," she said. "An older man in a coma. Standard treatments are no longer working. His family is searching for experimental options." I stayed silent. Each word seemed to move through the air very slowly. "Your antibodies," Hannah continued, "may be compatible with a therapy like that. If additional tests confirm it, your blood could save his life." The room seemed to shrink. I looked down at my hands that once wiped my child's nose, typed thousands of insurance files, trembled in the snowy wind just days ago. "You're saying, save his life?" I asked, my voice rough. Hannah nodded. "It's possible. No one can promise anything, but the possibility is real." I didn't know how to react. My thoughts were spinning. I had prepared myself for bad news, not for this. "The patient's family," Hannah went on, gentle but clear, "is willing to pay a very large amount for this experimental therapy because it isn't covered by insurance." I looked up at her. "A large amount?" She nodded. She didn't say the number, but her eyes said everything. I sat there unable to speak. A strange feeling spread through me. Not joy, not exactly fear, but total shock. 3 days ago, I had been thrown out of a house because I no longer earned money. 3 days ago, I was a burden. And now, the only thing I had left, my own body, carried a value I had never imagined. I thought about Lauren, about the door slamming shut, about her cold words. Then I looked back at Hannah. "What do you need me to do?" I asked quietly. Hannah smiled, and in her eyes was something that looked like respect. "First, you need to know the choice is entirely yours," she said. "No one can force you." I just thought, "You should know that you are not worthless. You never were." Those words hit me harder than any diagnosis. I left the medical room walking slowly. The hallway looked the same, the lights just as cold, the other women still sitting in silence. But inside me, something had shifted. For the first time since the door at Lauren's house closed, I no longer felt erased. The only thing I had left turned out to have value. That day, Hannah drove me herself to the hospital. The air was still cold, snow not yet fully melted along the curb, but the sky was brighter than it had been in days. The car passed through downtown Columbus, where tall glass buildings reflected the pale winter sunlight. I had lived here nearly my entire life, yet this time everything looked unfamiliar, as if I were stepping into a world I had never been allowed to touch before. The hospital rose in front of me, large and silent, a pale concrete structure with endless rows of windows. The parking lot was nearly full. Ambulances moved in and out, lights flashing in the cold haze. I stood at the entrance for a few seconds, pulling my collar higher, my palms sweating despite the low temperature. I had brought Lauren to this hospital when she was little, during bouts of pneumonia or high fever. Back then, I was the anxious mother, gripping her hand, ready to do anything to protect her. Now I walked in alone, in a completely different role. Not a family member, not medical staff. I was a homeless woman carrying something whose value I barely understood. We took the elevator up. When the doors opened, a familiar smell hit me, the sharper scent of disinfectant, metal, and the cold air of medical equipment. The sign was clear: ICU, Intensive Care Unit. I swallowed. Hannah led me down a long hallway where machines hummed steadily, like the mechanical breathing of the entire floor. Through glass windows, I saw brightly lit rooms, bodies lying motionless, tubes and wires everywhere. Each room held a story suspended between life and death. We stopped in front of a room at the end of the hall. Hannah knocked softly, then opened the door. A woman stood up when we entered. She looked to be in her early 70s, slender silver hair neatly combed. She wore a light gray sweater and dark slacks, simple, understated. But what caught my attention most were her eyes, red from lack of sleep, yet holding an unusual calm. "Are you Evelyn?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. I nodded. "Yes." She stepped forward and took my hands in both of hers. Her hands were warm, slightly trembling. "I'm Margaret Bennett," she said, "Richard's wife." I didn't know what to say. I only felt the way she held my hands, not like grasping a lifeline, but like holding another human being. No pleading, no pressure, just quiet gratitude, without any promises demanded. Through the glass behind her, I saw the man lying in the hospital bed. He was thinner than I expected, silver-haired, his face so still it almost didn't seem real. The machines around him beeped steadily, reminding us that his life was being held in place by technology. "Richard Bennett," Hannah said quietly beside me, 74 years old. I had heard that name somewhere before, on the news, in evening business reports when I still lived with Lauren. A successful businessman who built a large logistics company from nothing. But seeing him there, I didn't see wealth or power. I saw a man sleeping very deeply and a wife waiting for him to wake up. We stepped into the waiting area, where the lights were softer. A doctor approached, introduced himself and his title, then invited us to sit. He spoke slowly and carefully, choosing each word as if afraid of breaking something fragile hanging between us. He explained that Richard had a rare immune disorder that led to severe neurological complications. Standard treatments were no longer effective. He emphasized that the therapy they were considering was experimental, with no clear precedent and no guarantee of success. I listened, but my mind drifted. I watched Margaret sitting beside me, hands clasped, back straight, eyes fixed on the doctor. She didn't interrupt. She didn't press for answers. She listened like someone who had heard similar explanations too many times, yet still hadn't let go of hope. "We need completely voluntary consent," the doctor said, turning to me. "You have no obligation to do this, and you must understand the risks for both sides." I nodded. I didn't feel cornered. No one looked at me like a commodity. No one said I had to do this. That, more than anything, made me tremble. Then the doctor mentioned the compensation. The number was spoken lightly, professionally, as if it were just an administrative detail, but it landed in my ears like a stone. $500,000. I heard every syllable clearly. I didn't ask him to repeat it. I just sat there staring at my worn shoes, the scuffs on the toes, trying not to laugh or cry at the absurdity of life. $500,000, an amount large enough to completely change the rest of my life. I thought about the small apartment I once had, about not having to line up at the shelter every night, about never again seeing the calculating look in my daughter's eyes whenever money came up. I imagined a small house with sunlit windows, with a table where I could sit and drink my morning coffee without anyone asking, "When are you leaving?" I also thought about Lauren, about what she had said. Someone who no longer earns money. I wondered what kind of look she would give me if she knew that number, but I didn't say it out loud. Not to the doctor, not to Margaret, and certainly not to my daughter. "I need time to think," I said, finally finding my voice. Margaret squeezed my hand gently. "Whatever you decide," she said, "I'm still grateful that you came here." That sentence, no demands, no strings attached, made my chest ache. I realized how accustomed I had become to being asked, to being used, to the point where this simple, genuine respect left me unsettled. On the way back to the shelter, I sat quietly in the car. Hannah didn't ask whether I had decided yet. She just drove, giving me the space I needed. That night, I lay on the familiar bunk bed, staring at the ceiling. The wind whistled through the crack in the window. Everything was the same, but I wasn't. I knew I would agree, not just because of our money, but because for the first time in a long while I had the right to choose, and that choice could give me a life that no longer depended on anyone's unpredictable goodwill. I closed my eyes, the decision already clear in my heart, and I knew one thing for sure. Lauren would not know about this. At least, not yet. 3 days after the hospital meeting, just as I returned to the shelter after a long, dragging afternoon at the public library, the staff on duty called my name from the end of the hallway. "Evelyn Carter, you have a phone call." I froze. Not many people knew I was here. In fact, almost no one did. I hadn't called Lauren. I hadn't called any relatives either. That silence was intentional, a fragile buffer so I could breathe, think, and not be pulled back into the familiar spiral. I picked up the receiver, my heart beating slowly but heavily. "Hello?" There was a very brief pause on the other end of the line. Then I heard my daughter's voice, Lauren's voice, but not the voice I had heard the last time outside the house in the snowstorm. "Mom, it's me." Her voice was softer. more careful, as if every word had been weighed before being spoken. I didn't respond right away. I didn't want to react on instinct. I just held the receiver tightly and listened to my own breathing. "I've been looking for you these past few days," Lauren continued. I was worried about you. Worried about me. The words sounded strange. 3 days ago, I was a burden to be removed. 3 days later, I had become someone to worry about. The change came too fast for me to believe it was natural. "I asked around everywhere," she went on, her voice trembling slightly. "I finally found out you're staying at a shelter. Oh my God, Mom, why didn't you call me?" I closed my eyes. I could picture her face clearly as she said that. The face of someone playing concern very well. But I had lived with her long enough to know the difference between genuine worry and purposeful worry. "I'm sorry," Lauren said quickly, as if afraid I would interrupt. "I've been thinking a lot. About that day, about what I said. I was under too much pressure. Everything hit at once." I stayed silent. "The kids miss you so much." She shifted her tone, noticeably softer. "Tommy asks every night where Grandma is, the one who reads to him, and little Emily keeps an empty chair in the living room, saying it's for Grandma when she comes back." I bit my lip, not because I was moved, but because I recognized that familiar tactic. When money couldn't move me, Lauren always knew exactly what to use. "Mom," she said, almost whispering, "no matter what happens, we're still family. Family doesn't abandon each other." Family. That word coming from my daughter's mouth now no longer carried the sacred meaning I once believed in. It sounded like a key, meant to reopen a door she, herself, had slammed shut. "I want you to come home," Lauren said directly after a brief pause. "Home is still your home. I've been thinking these past few days. I can't let you live in a place like that." I opened my eyes and looked at the wall in front of me. Pale beige, a thin crack running along the edge of the ceiling. The silence was so complete I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. "I'll rearrange everything," Lauren said. "We'll figure something out. Jason agrees too. You just need to come back." Jason agrees. I remembered my son-in-law sitting on the couch, beer can in hand, eyes glued to the screen, when I dragged my suitcase out of the house. I couldn't recall him looking at me even once that day. "I'll come pick you up," Lauren continued, as if afraid I might refuse. "Even tonight if you want." I took a deep breath. Something in her voice didn't sit right. Too rushed, too eager, as if she were afraid I might disappear again. "Lauren," I said at last. My voice was so calm it surprised even me. "How did you know I was here?" There was a very brief silence on the other end of the line, but it was long enough. I asked around," she replied. "Someone I know, at church." I didn't ask more. I didn't need to press. I had heard what I needed to hear, or rather, what she hadn't said. She knew more than she was admitting. "I heard that you saw a doctor," Lauren said quietly. "Had some tests done?" My heart tightened slightly, but my face didn't change. "At a shelter, everyone has to get a health check," I replied. "That's nothing unusual." "Yeah, I was just asking," she said quickly. Then she rushed back into her familiar tone. "I'm just worried about you. Really." I didn't argue. I didn't expose anything either. I let the silence stretch between us. In that silence, I observed, not my daughter, but my own reaction. I no longer felt the urge to explain, no longer felt the need to be understood. There was only a cold clarity, like a lake frozen over after many days of deep frost. "Can I come pick you up?" Lauren asked again for the third time. "Not for now," I said. "I need more time." "Time?" Her voice wavered. "Time for what? You're staying in a place—" "I'm safe. I cut in, keeping my voice steady. "I have a place to sleep. There are people helping." I heard a sharp breath on the other end. I imagined Lauren pressing her lips together, trying to stay composed. "You're angry with me," she said. It wasn't a question. I thought for a few seconds. "I'm not angry," I replied. "I'm just observing." "Observing what?" Lauren asked, her voice rising. "Observing who truly misses me," I said. "And for what reason?" I heard Lauren swallow. "You're overthinking things again," she said, irritation creeping in. "You always do that. You imagine things." I gave a faint smile. That was the line she always used whenever I got too close to the truth. "Lauren," I said slowly, "I didn't say I'm not coming back. I just said not yet." I hung up before she could respond. I stood there, the receiver still warm in my hand, and felt one thing very clearly. That call didn't come from pure longing. It carried worry, but not worry for me. Worry about something that might be about to happen. That evening, I didn't go to sleep right away. I sat on the bunk bed, opened my small handbag, and took out the old notebook I always carried with me. It had been with me for years, filled with to-do lists, numbers, things I didn't want to forget. I opened to a blank page. For the first time, I didn't write about bills. I didn't write about having to apologize to anyone. I wrote only one line. Say nothing more. Observe. Keep it secret. I didn't know exactly how much Lauren had found out, but I knew one thing for certain. She wasn't looking for me just because of family, and if she thought I was still the woman who would rush back just because of the word family, then this time she had misjudged me. Outside the window, the wind grew stronger. Snow hit the glass with dry, sharp sounds. I pulled the blanket up, lay down, and in that familiar darkness, I began preparing for what came next, not with impulsiveness, but with silence. Silence this time was my weapon. The first treatment was scheduled for Monday morning. I woke up very early, even before the hallway lights came on. Not from anxiety, but because my body was used to waking early after decades of routine. I folded my blanket, got dressed, and sat waiting in silence, listening to the familiar sounds of the shelter slowly waking up. Hannah arrived to pick me up right on time. In the car, she spoke very little, only asking if I was okay, if I needed to stop. I answered briefly. My mind had no room left for wandering thoughts. Everything felt unusually focused, as if I were stepping into a task that simply needed to be done. At the hospital, everything moved quickly but carefully. I was led into a private treatment room, brighter and quieter than I had expected. A reclining chair stood in the center, next to machines with neatly coiled transparent tubes. The familiar disinfectant smell was there, but it no longer overwhelmed me, like it had the first time I entered the ICU. Margaret was already there when I arrived. She stood up immediately, relief flickering in her eyes when she saw me. "Thank you for coming," she said sincerely, without a trace of politeness for show. I nodded, unsure how to respond adequately. As I sat down in the chair, the nurse began preparing. The needle, the tubing, the precise, practiced movements. I looked up at the ceiling, where the white lights shone more gently than I had expected. I breathed evenly, trying to keep my body relaxed. While waiting for the machine to start, I turned my head toward the large glass window separating the treatment room from the ICU outside. Through the glass, I could see Richard's room. He lay there just as before, unmoving. But today, as I looked more closely, a strange feeling crept into me, a vague familiarity with no clear source. I had seen many faces in my life, at work, at Lauren's school, in the old neighborhood, But this wasn't like logically recognizing someone. It was like hearing a melody you haven't heard in years, and before you can remember its name, your heart sinks over something very old. I studied his face through the glass. The silver hair, the features thinned by illness, but still familiar, especially the eyebrows and the straight bridge of his nose. I didn't say anything, telling myself I was imagining things. My mind had been overloaded these past few days. The treatment began. I felt my blood being drawn out, passing through the machine, then returning to my body. It didn't hurt, just a slight fatigue, like after a long workday. Margaret sat nearby, hands resting on her handbag, back straight, eyes never leaving me. She didn't speak, only offering the faintest smiles now and then, as if to reassure me. "Are you feeling uncomfortable?" a nurse asked. "No," I replied. "I'm fine." In that slow, quiet time, thoughts I hadn't named began to surface. Old images, very old, ones I believed had been buried under layers of responsibility and years, suddenly came into focus. A summer afternoon, blazing sunlight, a tall, thin young man with a bright smile leaning against a wooden fence, the sound of cicadas, the smell of dry grass. My heart skipped a beat. Impossible, I told myself. That couldn't be it. But when I looked again at Richard, not the present face on the hospital bed, but the features hidden beneath age, the memory took on clearer shape. I remembered a name I hadn't thought of in a very long time, a name I once promised myself I would forget so I could keep living. Richard. Not Bennett, just Richard. I remembered being 19. I remembered afternoons after school, conversations that stretched on until we lost track of time. I remembered being looked at with eyes full of trust and promise. I remembered a young man telling me, "Someday we'll have the whole world." But the world didn't wait for us. My family went through a crisis back then. My mother became seriously ill. I had to leave school and start working early, stay in our small town while Richard received a scholarship and left. We wrote letters to each other for a while. Then the letters grew fewer. Not because the love faded, but because life pulled each of us in different directions, relentlessly. I never knew what happened to Richard after that. I got married. I had Lauren. I stayed so busy there was no space left for unanswered questions. And over time, that memory was tucked away in a very deep corner, one I no longer touched, until now. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to Margaret. She was looking at me, her eyes gentle but sharp, as if she had noticed the change in me. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. I nodded, but my throat tightened. I didn't know what I should ask, or whether I should ask anything at all. I was afraid of breaking this fragile balance, afraid that if I spoke it out loud, everything would become complicated in ways I couldn't foresee. But Margaret spoke first. "Perhaps Richard feels familiar to you," she said very slowly. Not as a question, but as a gentle confirmation. I looked at her, my heart pounding. "I'm not sure," I replied. "It's just a feeling." Margaret gave a sad smile. "He once told me about someone," she said, "a long time before he met me." I held my breath. "A girl from his old hometown," she continued. "He said she was his first love, the person he never forgot." I felt my hand tremble slightly on the armrest. All the sounds around us seemed to fade away. Only Margaret's voice remained, clear down to every word. "He tried to find you," Margaret said, "many years ago, but he couldn't." I closed my eyes. The years of silence, the letters that were never answered, the questions that were never asked. All of it suddenly came together into a picture I hadn't known I was missing. You knew about this? I asked, my voice rough. Margaret nodded. I knew, she said, from the very beginning. Richard never hid it from me. He was always honest. There was no jealousy in her voice, no resentment, only the quiet acceptance of someone who had lived long enough to understand that love isn't always about possession. He loves me, Margaret went on very firmly, and I know that. But I also know there's a part of his heart that belongs to the past. I never saw that as a threat. Tears spilled over before I could stop them, not from pain, but from a feeling that was too full. A deep, quiet emotion stretched across more than 40 years, finally finding its name. Margaret's kindness left me stunned. She didn't look at me as someone intruding on her marriage. She looked at me as an old piece of her husband's life, one that had unexpectedly returned at a moment no one could have predicted. Maybe. It isn't a coincidence, Margaret said softly, glancing toward the ICU room, that you're the one who can help him. I looked at Richard, the man who had once been the young man standing by a wooden fence, the man I had loved, then lost, then buried in memory. Now his life was tied to my blood in a way no one could have planned with reason. In that moment, I understood something very clearly. This wasn't just about money, not just a deal, not just a chance for me to stand on my own again. This was a circle closing after more than 40 years. A connection I thought was lost had only been sleeping. And for the first time since my life collapsed in that snowstorm, I felt like I was standing in the right place. Not as someone being used, but as part of something larger than my own losses. The treatment machine let out a soft beep, signaling the first phase was complete. I opened my eyes and took a deep breath. I knew I would continue, without hesitation, without turning back. Lauren didn't wait long. Just 2 days after the second treatment, while my body was still tired and my mind hadn't fully returned to its normal rhythm, she showed up, without notice, without asking, as if her patience had completely run out. That afternoon was dull and gray. I was sitting in the shelter's common room, halfway through an old book borrowed from the library. Outside the glass doors, the snow had stopped falling, but the sky still felt heavy, as if it wasn't ready for any thaw yet. The front desk worker approached me carefully. "Ms. Evelyn, someone is here to see you. Says she's your daughter." I closed the book and set it on the table. I wasn't surprised. Just a familiar chill settled in, the kind you feel when you know pain is coming but still have to face it. Lauren stood in the lobby wearing the expensive beige coat I remembered clearly, one I had helped pay for 2 years ago as a birthday gift. Light makeup, neatly styled hair. She didn't look like someone searching for her mother after days apart. She looked like someone arriving to deal with unfinished business. "Mom," Lauren said when she saw me. Her voice was no longer soft like it had been on the phone, polite but cold. "Lauren," I replied, nodding. There was no hug, no, "Are you okay?" She glanced around, her eyes sweeping quickly over the worn chairs and peeling paint, as if the very presence of this place made her uncomfortable. "We need to talk," Lauren said flatly, "in private." I followed her outside. It was cold, but not as biting as the day I was thrown out of the house. We stood near the parking lot where the wind rushed through open spaces. Lauren opened her handbag and pulled out a neatly clipped stack of papers. "I don't want to go in circles," she said. "I spoke to a friend who works in the legal field." I looked at the papers in her hand. I didn't ask anything. I waited. "What you're doing," Lauren continued, her voice growing firmer, "is legally complicated. You're involved in an experimental treatment. There's money involved, a lot of money." I looked straight into her eyes. And? And you need protection, Lauren said quickly. You're in a vulnerable state. You just lost your job. You've been emotionally traumatized. It's very easy for someone to take advantage of you. I let out a quiet laugh, not because it was funny, but because I recognized that tone. It was the voice of someone speaking for me, but not for my benefit. What are you trying to say? I asked. Lauren held the papers out toward me. I think it's best if you sign these. I didn't take them. What are they? Temporary power of attorney, Lauren replied. It allows me to manage financial decisions related to that money on your behalf. I looked at my hands, thin hands, spotted with age, hands that had worked nonstop for 30 years, held her as a child, signed hundreds of documents over a lifetime, and yet had never trembled like this, not from fear, but from a very different kind of pain. Manage it for me, I repeated slowly. Yes, Lauren said. You're not used to handling amounts like that. I have more experience. I just want to make sure everything is handled properly. Taxes, legal responsibility, risks if there are disputes. You're talking as if I'm no longer capable of understanding things, I said. Lauren sighed, as if I were making things harder than they needed to be. Mom, don't overreact. This is just a precaution. I looked at her, very carefully, and for the first time I no longer saw my daughter in her eyes. I saw a stranger, someone weighing benefits, calculating moves, trying to control something she believed was slipping away. Who did you talk to? I asked. Lauren hesitated for a second. A lawyer. I don't want you getting into trouble. Your lawyer, I corrected. She didn't deny it. Lauren, I said, word by word, do you remember the last time you asked me what I wanted? She frowned. This isn't the time to bring up the past. For you, maybe not, I replied. But for me, it is. Lauren grew impatient. Mom, I'm trying to help you, but if you don't cooperate, things could get complicated. How complicated? I asked. She looked at me, her eyes noticeably colder. If necessary, I could request an evaluation of your capacity. You're being influenced by outsiders. People might think you were manipulated. The word landed between us like a blade. Manipulated. I felt something inside me finally snap. Not just now, but the delayed breaking of a relationship that had been cracked for a long time. What did you just say? I asked quietly. You know what I mean, Lauren replied without backing down. I just want everything clear before it's too late. I nodded, slowly, calmly. So calmly it surprised even me. So you didn't come here because you miss me, I said. You came because you're afraid of losing control. That's not true, Lauren protested immediately, but her voice lacked conviction. Would you be looking for me, I continued, if there wasn't that money? Her silence answered for her. In that moment, I understood very clearly. Lauren no longer saw me as her mother. She saw me as a variable, a risk, an asset that needed to be controlled. I didn't take the papers. I didn't argue further. You should go, I said. I need time to think. You can't make decisions on your own, Lauren snapped. I'm clear-headed enough to know I'm not signing anything today, I cut in, and you don't have the right to force me. Lauren stared at me for a few seconds, then shoved the papers back into her bag. I'm just trying to do the right thing, she said coldly. Don't regret this later. She turned and walked quickly toward her car. I stood there, the wind cutting against my face, realizing that the greatest pain wasn't being thrown out of the house. It was being treated as someone no longer fit to own her own life. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the bunk bed, opened my old notebook, and turned to a fresh page. This time, I wrote more than one line. I wrote, "Find a lawyer, independently, not connected to Lauren." The next morning, I asked Hannah to recommend an independent law office. She didn't ask many questions, just looked at me with understanding. Perhaps she'd seen this scenario too many times before. The lawyer's name was Daniel Brooks, around 50 years old. He spoke slowly and clearly. He listened as I told my story, without interrupting, without judging. When I finished, he nodded. "You have every right to protect yourself," he said, "and the first step is making sure no one can use concern as a reason to take away your right to decide." We completed a formal capacity declaration, clear, thorough, no ambiguity. We drafted a temporary will, not because I thought I was about to die, but because I understood that when money appears, so does greed. For the first time in my life, I signed documents not to serve someone else, but to protect myself. When I left the law office, I walked slowly along the sidewalk dusted with thin snow. It was cold, yet my chest felt strangely warm. I had lost many things, but at least I was no longer a woman anyone could step on in the name of family. And for the first time in many years, I knew one thing for certain. I was standing on my own side. The fifth treatment took place on a morning that was unusually quiet. No snow, no rain, just a thin layer of clouds covering the city sky, softening the light that filtered into the hospital like diluted watercolor. I arrived earlier than usual, sat in the familiar waiting room, my small bag in my hands, feeling a calm I hadn't expected. My body had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the treatments. The fatigue was still there, but it no longer frightened me. I understood the light dizziness, the moments of weakness, and the hollow feeling after each blood draw weren't signs of loss, but of a process moving in the right direction. I no longer thought about money when I entered the treatment room. Strangely enough, that was true. I thought about something else, something softer, deeper. Margaret arrived shortly after me. She wore a light gray sweater, her hair neatly tied back. Her eyes looked different that day, less worn, more hopeful, as if a small light had been lit inside her, bright enough to guide the way. The doctor said some of the numbers look very promising, she said softly as she sat beside me. "We'll know more after today." I nodded. I didn't ask anything further. I had learned that some things don't need to be spoken aloud to matter. Margaret's silence then wasn't worry. It was waiting. Inside the treatment room, the machine started up, producing steady, familiar sounds. The nurse checked the readings and took careful notes. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. Each time the needle touched my skin, I thought about the years I had endured in silence, not from submission, but because I once believed it was the only way to love. This time, I let my thoughts drift gently. I thought of a long-ago afternoon in a small town where Richard and I once sat by the river, talking about big dreams and the voices of people who still believed time was always on their side. I thought of the years I spent being a mother, an employee, the stable woman in everyone's eyes, yet never truly asking myself whether I was happy. When the treatment ended, a nurse hurried into the room, her expression unusual. She looked at Margaret first, then at me. "Please wait a moment," she said. "The doctor wants to see you right away." My heart tightened slightly, not from fear, but from a very strong intuition. Margaret stood up, her hand trembling faintly. I followed her out down the long hallway leading back to the ICU. Each step seemed slower than usual, as if the space itself were stretching to test our patience. Dr. Bennett stood outside the room, his face serious but his eyes bright. He didn't waste time. "There's a response," he said. "A clear one." Margaret raised a hand to cover her mouth. For a few seconds, my mind went completely blank. "What kind of response?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Increased neurological activity," the doctor replied. "We've seen steady improvement over the past 2 days, but this morning it was stronger, much stronger." He opened the door and gestured for us to come in. Richard lay there, still thin, still connected to the familiar machines. But something had changed. I noticed it immediately, even before the doctor said anything more. His eyelids twitched, not a random reflex, a deliberate movement. Margaret gripped my hand tightly. "Richard," she called, her voice breaking. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, his eyes opened very slowly, very heavily, as if he had to pull an entire ruined world out of a long sleep to return. The air in the room froze. "Richard," Margaret whispered, tears spilling over. He looked around, his gaze cloudy, disoriented. Then his eyes stopped, not on Margaret, not on the doctor, but on me. I stood there, my heart pounding. I didn't move. I didn't dare breathe too deeply. His lips moved slightly, no sound. Then again. This time, very softly, very weak, but enough for me to hear. "Evelyn." The entire room erupted. Margaret broke into sobs. The doctor turned, signaling the medical team. Nurses rushed in. Equipment was adjusted. Rapid medical instructions filled the air. But all those sounds felt distant to me. He said my name, not Margaret. Not a mistaken name. It was me. The name no one had spoken in that voice for more than 40 years. I stepped closer, my hands trembling so badly I had to grip the edge of the bed. "I'm here," I said softly. "I'm here." His eyes focused more clearly, sharper. A very faint, very weak smile appeared, but it was the smile I remembered. The smile of the young man who once said we would have the whole world. "I knew," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "I knew you'd be here." I couldn't hold back my tears, not from pain, not from regret, but from something pure, being seen, being remembered, being called by name, not out of obligation, but out of feeling. The Bennett family stood around the bed. I saw emotional faces, reddened eyes. There was no discomfort, no suspicious glances. No one asked why he had called my name. No one asked me to step back. No one mentioned money. Margaret turned to me, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she smiled. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for bringing him back." I shook my head. "No," I said. "We did this together." Over the next few hours, Richard became more alert. He didn't speak much. Each sentence required enormous effort, but he held Margaret's hand. He looked at his children. He looked at me, as if trying to memorize every detail, afraid that if he blinked, it would all disappear. No one asked anything of me. No one asked how long I would continue treatment, how I would receive the money, or what I planned to do next. No one mentioned responsibility or obligation. I wasn't placed in a position where I had to repay anything. For the first time in a very long while, I was simply present, and that was enough. That evening, I sat alone in my small room at the shelter, looking out the window. Streetlights cast a golden glow over the thin layer of snow. I thought about Lauren, about the stack of power of attorney papers, about the way she had looked at me as something that needed to be controlled. Then I thought about Margaret, about the way she held my hand, about how the Bennett family stood around the hospital bed without asking a single question about me except whether I was okay. And I understood. Real family doesn't come from blood or beautiful words. It comes from respect, from not treating someone as a means to get what you want. I had lived too long in a family where love always came with conditions. And now, standing before an undeniable miracle, I finally realized how many years I had confused obligation with love. Richard had woken up, but the one who truly awakened was me. The news that Lauren had lost her house reached me on a morning that seemed perfectly ordinary. I was sitting in the small room at the shelter, organizing a few personal belongings, when my phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering, no longer rushing the way I used to. "Hello?" Lauren's voice came through immediately, hoarse and urgent. No small talk, no awkward greetings. "Mom, I don't have a place to live anymore." I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair. I had sensed this would happen. I just hadn't expected it to come so soon. "The bank foreclosed on the house," Lauren went on, her breathing rapid. "Jason, he really lost his job this time. For real. We can't manage anymore." I didn't speak. I let the silence stretch. Not as punishment, but to hear everything my daughter was trying to say and everything she wasn't. "Mom," Lauren lowered her voice, sounding weaker. "I know I was wrong. I know I said things I shouldn't have. But now we really need you." The sentence fell into the familiar space between us, just as it had so many times before. The only difference was that this time, I didn't rush to fill it. "What about the kids?" I asked evenly. Lauren seemed ready for that question. "Tommy and Emily, they're panicking, Mom. They don't understand what's happening. Tommy cries all night. Emily keeps asking when we can go back to the old house." My throat tightened. Images of the two children came sharply into focus. Our evenings reading together, the mornings I made breakfast before work. They weren't at fault. I knew that better than anyone. "Mom," Lauren said, her voice beginning to tremble deliberately, "you can't abandon your grandchildren. No matter what, you're still their grandmother." Grandmother. Not mother, not family. A role. One I was reminded of whenever emotions needed to be stirred. "What do you want?" I asked. Lauren was silent for a few seconds, then spoke quickly, as if afraid I might change my mind. "Just help us temporarily. You're in a better position now. Just for a while. Until we get back on our feet." I opened my eyes and looked out the window. Pale sunlight. Most of the snow on the sidewalk had melted, leaving gray streaks of water. Winter was retreating, but melting doesn't always bring relief. "Lauren," I said slowly, "do you remember the last time you told me you couldn't support another person who doesn't earn money?" Her voice stalled. "Mom." I already apologized. "Did you apologize because you were afraid of losing money," I continued, "or because you truly understood what you did?" Lauren hesitated. "I don't know how to say it so you'll believe me." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I believe you're scared," I said. "I believe you're desperate, but I don't believe you've changed." "I have changed," Lauren said loudly, almost pleading. "Can't you see? I'm calling you. I'm begging." "Begging," I repeated. "Or bargaining." There was no immediate answer. I heard Lauren breathe heavily, then her voice shifted to a different tone, softer, lower. "Mom," she said, "you can endure this, but the kids can't. Do you want them sleeping on someone else's couch? Growing up, feeling abandoned?" That sentence struck the deepest part of me. I felt a pain I knew all too well. The pain of a woman who once sacrificed everything so her child wouldn't lack anything. It pulled me back years, to the days I worked 2 jobs, to the times I skipped meals so Lauren could pay tuition. I stayed silent for a long time, not because I was wavering, but because I needed to be sure where I stood. "Lauren," I said finally, "do you know why I didn't come back home that day?" "Because you were angry," she answered quickly. "No," I said, "because I realized something." "What?" "That if I keep rescuing you from the consequences of your choices," I said clearly, word by word, "you will never learn how to take responsibility for your own life." "But this time is different," Lauren pleaded. "This time it's for the kids." I closed my eyes. Images of Tommy and Emily rose again. My heart hurt, truly hurt. But the pain no longer disoriented me. "I love my grandchildren," I said. "That hasn't changed." "Then, but I won't return to the role of unconditional rescuer," I cut in. "Not for you, not for anyone." "So you're going to let them be homeless?" Lauren snapped, anger creeping in. "No," I replied. "You and Jason are adults. You can find solutions. A smaller apartment, different jobs, community assistance. Many families have had to do the same." "But you have money," Lauren blurted out. "You could fix everything with just one check." "And then what?" I asked. "Then you'd make decisions for me again. Calculate how much I'm worth. Remind me that family only exists when it's convenient." Lauren fell silent. I heard her crying, not an outburst, but tight, frustrated sobs. "You're cruel," Lauren said. "You've changed." I opened my eyes and looked straight at the light outside the window. "Yes," I said, "I have changed." "Before, you would never say no," Lauren went on. "No matter what, you would help." "Before, I was afraid of being abandoned," I replied. "Now I'm not." The words rang clearly inside me, not as a declaration, but as an accepted truth. "I don't hate you," I added, my voice softening, "but I can't keep sacrificing myself so you can feel secure." "Then who are you choosing?" Lauren asked, her voice turning cold. "Those strangers?" I gave a sad smile. "I'm choosing myself." The call ended quietly. No goodbye. Just a long pause, and then Lauren hung up. I set the phone down on the table. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't tighten the way I had expected. There was real sadness. Sadness for my daughter, for my grandchildren, for what could have been different. But beneath that sadness was a steadiness I had never known before. For the first time in my life, I said no without guilt, without feeling selfish, without feeling ungrateful, without feeling like a bad mother. I simply felt like a woman who had lived long enough to understand that love does not mean self-destruction. That evening, I went to the hospital to visit Richard. He was speaking more. His voice was still weak, but his eyes were bright. Margaret sat beside the bed, holding his hand. They looked at me as I entered, smiling without conditions. "Are you okay?" Margaret asked. I nodded. "I am." And it wasn't a polite answer. I didn't turn back. And for the first time, I knew for sure I was moving in the right direction. I signed the papers to buy my house on an early spring morning, when the city still held scattered patches of old snow that hadn't fully melted yet. The air was cold, but the sunlight was different. No longer the heavy gray of winter, but a pale, clear light, like a reminder that everything can begin again. The house wasn't big. 2 small bedrooms, a living room just large enough for a sofa and a bookshelf, and a bright kitchen with a window looking out onto the backyard. Nothing luxurious, no white picket fence like in the movies. But when I stepped across the threshold for the first time with the keys in my hand, I knew with absolute clarity this was my home, not my daughter's house, not a place I was staying temporarily, not a roof tied to conditions, just a home, mine. I stood for a long time in the empty living room, listening to the soft echo of my footsteps on the newly polished wooden floor. The sound made me smile. For years, I had learned to walk quietly, to take up as little space as possible, to exist in a way that wouldn't inconvenience anyone. And now, my footsteps were allowed to be heard, without apology, without hesitation. I bought the house about a 10-minute walk from Richard and Margaret's place, not because I wanted to cling to them, but because I valued the right kind of closeness, near but not merged, connected but not dependent. Margaret helped me choose the curtains. Richard, once his health had improved, planted a few flower bushes with me in the front yard. We didn't talk much about the past. We didn't need to. Some things once acknowledged don't need to be repeated. I moved into the new house quietly. No housewarming party, no announcements. Just Hannah helping me carry a few boxes and Margaret bringing over a tray of still warm pastries. "Welcome home," she said, setting the tray on the kitchen counter. I stood there, looking at the kitchen glowing in the afternoon light, and for the first time in my life, I truly felt the meaning of those words. In the days that followed, I began arranging my life according to my own rhythm. I woke up when I wanted. I made coffee the way I liked it, unhurried, without preparing it for anyone else. I read in the mornings, took walks in the afternoons, and cooked simple meals just to nourish myself, not to prove anything. Money, the thing that had once been the greatest anxiety of my life, was no longer the center of every thought. I used it carefully with planning, but I didn't let it control me. I paid off the small remaining debts from before. I bought better health insurance. I set aside some for short trips I had always told myself were unnecessary. But the most important thing wasn't the house or financial stability. It was a decision I made one quiet afternoon while sitting alone in my new living room. I opened my old notebook, the one that had followed me through my worst days, and wrote a new heading, "A Fund for Older Women." The idea didn't come from ambition or a desire for praise. It came from the image of Rosa, the woman I had met at the shelter, from the faces I had seen on cold nights, women who had once had families, once worked their whole lives, and then one day were treated as expendable. I knew that feeling. I had lived it. My fund wasn't large. I didn't build a grand organization. I simply created a small fund, enough to help a few women with rental deposits, enough to cover a few legal consultations, enough to give them time to stand on their feet before being swept away. I named it Second Dawn, not because I thought I was saving anyone, but because I believed no one should be denied the chance to begin again just because they had already lived too many years. I met those women in my kitchen. We drank tea. We talked. Not as victims, but as people who had lived long enough to understand that life can be cruel. But it doesn't always have to end in the worst way. Some cried. Some were angry. Some stayed silent for a long time before daring to tell their stories. I didn't fix them. I just listened. And sometimes that was enough. Lauren didn't call me anymore. News about her reached me through others, through a distant relative, through bits of overheard conversation. She and Jason moved into a smaller apartment. The kids changed schools. Their life was difficult, but it went on. I thought about my grandchildren often. I wrote them short letters. No blame, no explanations, just telling them about Grandma's little front garden, about the stray cat I fed every morning, about afternoons spent reading on the porch. I didn't know whether Lauren gave them the letters or not, but I kept writing, not to pull them back, but to keep my love from turning into resentment. One afternoon, while I was watering the plants in the yard, Richard stopped by. He walked slowly, but his posture was steadier. We sat on the front steps, watching the sun sink behind the roof across the street. "Do you regret anything?" he asked softly. I thought for a moment. "Yes," I said. "I regret living too long out of obligation." Richard nodded as if he had already understood. "But you don't do that anymore." "No," I said, "I don't. I don't live to play the role of the perfect mother. I don't live to be recognized as a self-sacrificing woman. I don't live to keep the peace by staying silent. I live for myself. I choose the meals I like. I choose the house I live in. I choose to help when I want to, not when I'm pressured. I choose to say yes and no based on clarity, not on the fear of being abandoned. My new life isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, but it's steady, like a tree that has taken deep root after a storm. And for the first time, I don't feel the need to apologize for that. I don't run from the past. I don't deny the years I sacrificed. I simply put them where they belong, behind me. Ahead of me is a life I chose for myself. Many years have passed since the winter day I stood on my daughter's porch, snow covering my shoulders, the door slamming shut behind me like a cold verdict. Time didn't erase that memory, but it changed its shape. No longer sharp like broken glass, it became a faded scar, a reminder that I was once hurt and that I survived. My life now is peaceful in a very ordinary way. Every morning, I wake up in my small house and open the window to let sunlight into the kitchen. I make coffee, water the plants on the porch, listen to birds perched on the wooden fence. There's no packed schedule, no one I need to prove anything to. I read, walk, cook, and occasionally drive to visit Margaret and Richard. Visits without obligation, only voluntary presence. Richard has nearly fully recovered. We sit on their porch on long afternoons, talking about small things, the weather, a good book, the morning news. Sometimes we sit in silence for a long time, and that silence no longer makes me feel lacking. It's full in its own way. We don't try to make up for the past. We let it rest, like an old photograph kept in a drawer, still there, but not something we need to take out every day. I still think about Lauren, not with anger, but with a mature sadness. I understand that she carries her own fears, fear of scarcity, fear of failure, fear of losing control. But I no longer allow those fears to decide my life. I love her the way a mother learns to love after many losses, with love, but with boundaries. I still love my grandchildren. That has never changed. I keep photos of Tommy and Emily on my bookshelf, two gap-toothed smiles, two little faces that used to press against my shoulder every night. I send birthday gifts regularly. I write letters, not long, not heavy, just lines about the garden, about the cat I named Hope, about simple things I want them to know. Grandma is still here, still loving, but no longer hurting herself to be loved in return. Those boundaries aren't easy to keep. Some nights I lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'm selfish. But every time that question surfaces, I remember the woman I once was, the one who did everything for her child and was then erased from her child's life like an unnecessary expense. On my first night at the shelter, I promised myself I would never let anyone step on me again. And I've kept that promise, not with bitterness, but with clarity. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves began to turn yellow and a cool breeze passed over the porch, my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I answered with the calm habit formed over the years. "Grandma?" A small, hesitant voice said. My heart stuttered. I knew that voice even before my mind could catch up. "Tommy?" I asked, my voice trembling just slightly. "Yes," he said. I found your number in the contacts. Mom doesn't know." I sat down in the chair, gripping the phone tightly. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay," he said. wanted to hear your voice." That one sentence dissolved every defense I had. I closed my eyes, letting the autumn wind brush my cheek and listen to every breath of the grandchild I had missed every day. We didn't talk long about his new school, about math, which he didn't like, about Grandma's cat. He didn't ask why I didn't come back to live with the family. He didn't blame me. He was simply there, and that presence planted a small but steady hope inside me. After the call, I sat on the porch for a long time. Leaves drifted down onto the walkway. I understood then that seeds of love never disappear completely. They just need time and soil that isn't trampled by obligation or guilt to grow again. I don't regret it. I don't regret saying no. I don't regret choosing myself. If there's anything I regret, it's only that I didn't do it sooner. But life doesn't give us a rewind button. It only gives us choices from this moment forward. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't hurt anyone to prove I was right. I lived better, and that was my choice and the only answer I needed. I built a life where I am respected, where help is voluntary, where family is not a chain. Now, looking back, I understand that I lost one family, a family where love came with conditions. But I found myself again, the woman who has the right to choose how to live, how to love, and how to move forward. I'm telling this story not to blame anyone. I'm telling it to remember that sometimes leaving isn't running away, it's returning to yourself. And maybe, somewhere in this story, you see a part of yourself too. What city are you listening from? If you've ever been treated like a burden, please remember, your worth does not live in anyone else's wallet or decisions. Leave a comment. I truly want to know your story. Thank you for staying until the end. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, please like, subscribe, and stay with me. I still have so much more to tell.